My wife ignored my messages all day. At 11 at night, she finally came home and smirked. You know what happened, Alvin? I had a one-night stand with my boss, and I would do it again. I just nodded and finished my meal in silence. The next morning, she did not believe her eyes. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Alvin. I am 69 years old and an African-American man who spent 4 decades building a quiet, solid foundation. To the outside world and even to my own family, I am just a retired mechanic who managed a local auto shop for years. I live a very frugal life in a modest suburban neighborhood. My wife Vanessa is 62. She is an executive assistant and senior project manager at a high-end virtual reality tech company. We have been married for 40 long years. 40 years of me playing the silent, steady provider while she constantly chased status, corporate titles, and the illusion of high society. That Tuesday night, the house was completely still. I sat at the kitchen island eating a simple plate of cold roasted chicken and vegetables. I had texted Vanessa 5 times since the late afternoon to check on her. She ignored every single message. At exactly 11 o'clock, the front door swung open heavily. Vanessa stumbled inside. The thick stench of expensive gin mixed with a musky, unfamiliar men cologne flooded the hallway instantly. She kicked off her designer heels and tossed her leather purse onto the sofa with a careless, loud thud. She walked slowly into the kitchen. She did not look guilty or ashamed. She looked completely triumphant. Her expensive dress was wrinkled and her dark red lipstick was noticeably smeared across her mouth. She leaned against the cold granite counter and looked me right in the eyes. She let out an arrogant and cruel smirk. You know what happened, Alvin. I slept with Garrett today. He is my boss, and honestly, I am going to do it again. The words hit the quiet room like a physical blow. A 40-year marriage was casually executed on a Tuesday night. She stood there waiting for me to explode. She wanted me to shout or throw my plate against the wall. She wanted to see me break down. I did not give her that satisfaction. I simply picked up my fork and took another bite of my cold chicken. Vanessa crossed her arms and let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed in the kitchen. You are not even going to say anything. You are just going to sit there eating like a pathetic, invisible old man. That is exactly why I did it, Alvin. Garrett is a real man. He is a wealthy white CEO who drives a luxury sports car and wears custom-tailored suits. His suits cost more than you ever made in a month at that filthy machine shop. You smell like motor oil and cheap soap. I am sick and tired of living this mediocre life with a man who counts pennies at the grocery store. I chewed my food slowly and methodically. I swallowed and looked at her flushed, arrogant face. I remembered the very early days of our marriage. I worked 14-hour shifts at the shop 7 days a week. I ruined my knees and permanently calloused my hands so she could go to night school and get her master's degree in business. I wore the exact same pair of heavy work boots for 5 straight years so she could graduate without a single dollar of student loan debt. I chose to live simply to protect our family from financial ruin. I chose to build actual generational wealth instead of buying flashy watches or leasing cars we could not afford. She took my decades of bloody sacrifice and labeled it as poverty. She took my financial discipline and called it a massive failure. You are quiet because you know I am right, Alvin. She sneered, leaning closer so I could smell the alcohol on her breath. You are just a mechanic. You always will be a mechanic. Garrett is a visionary. He knows how to treat a modern, successful woman. I am not going to apologize for finding someone who actually matches my level. I wiped my mouth carefully with a paper napkin. I stood up from the wooden stool. I picked up my ceramic plate and walked slowly to the kitchen sink. Are you finished? I asked in a perfectly flat and emotionless tone. Vanessa rolled her eyes in sheer absolute disgust. You are unbelievable. You do not even have the spine to fight for your own wife. I am going to bed. Do not bother coming into the master bedroom tonight. Sleep on the couch. She turned around abruptly and marched up the wooden stairs. I listened to her heavy, aggressive footsteps. I heard the bedroom door slam shut with extreme force. The heavy metal lock clicked into place. I turned on the faucet and rinsed my plate. I washed my fork and dried my hands on a clean kitchen towel. I did not feel a single ounce of heartbreak or sorrow. I only felt a cold, absolute clarity spreading through my veins. For decades, I had played the role of the humble, retired mechanic perfectly. I let Vanessa buy her expensive clothes and live her corporate fantasy using the generous monthly allowance I provided. She had absolutely no idea who she was actually married to. She did not know that my frugality was a carefully constructed cover. She did not know that I am an angel investor and the majority shareholder of a massive venture capital firm called Apex Holdings. I walked into my home office and closed the door behind me. I pulled down the window blinds to block out the streetlights. I unlocked my bottom desk drawer and took out a highly secure smartphone, a phone Vanessa never knew existed in our home. I dialed a number I knew by heart. It was the direct private line to Mr. Hayes. He is a ruthless attorney and the senior partner who handles my private corporate estate. He answered immediately despite the late hour. "Good evening, Mr. Hayes," I said calmly. "Good evening, Alvin. What can I do for you tonight? I need to initiate a full financial restriction protocol immediately. I want all secondary credit cards canceled. I want the vehicle access completely revoked. We are going to start the purification process right now." "Understood, Alvin. It will be done in exactly 5 minutes." I ended the call. I woke up the next morning at 6 sharp as I always did. I made my black coffee and sat quietly at the kitchen table. The pale morning light filtered through the blinds. Everything in the house was exactly where it belonged. At 8 o'clock, I heard Vanessa coming down the stairs. She was dressed in a sharp beige business suit and expensive heels. Her hair was perfectly styled for another day at the office. She ignored me completely as she walked past the kitchen and headed straight for the garage door. She opened the door and stopped dead in her tracks. The garage was completely empty. The black luxury BMW sedan I had purchased for her last year was gone. I had arranged for a private towing company to quietly remove it from our driveway at 3 in the morning while she slept. The title was solely in my name. I had every legal right to relocate my own property. "What did you do with my car?" she screamed, walking back into the kitchen with wide, panicked eyes. "It is not your car, Vanessa," I replied, taking a slow, measured sip of my coffee. "I decided I no longer want to pay the insurance on it." She reached into her designer handbag with shaking, angry hands. She pulled out her leather wallet. "I am going to buy a new one today. You cannot control me, Alvin. You are just a broke old man." She opened her wallet to grab her platinum credit card. The card slot was completely empty. She looked down at the kitchen island. Sitting right next to my coffee mug were her 3 credit cards. They were cut precisely in half with heavy-duty metal shears. I placed a small white sticky note right above the shattered plastic pieces. "Call an Uber yourself." My phone started vibrating violently on the kitchen island. The caller ID flashed Vanessa's name. I let it ring 3 times before sliding my finger across the green icon and putting it on speaker. The sound of city traffic and angry car horns blared through the audio, followed immediately by her shrill, hysterical voice. "Alvin, you petty, pathetic old man!" she screamed at the top of her lungs, standing somewhere on a busy downtown sidewalk. "My Uber driver just canceled and my cards are declining everywhere. Do you honestly think cutting up my plastic is going to stop me from living my life? You are making the biggest mistake of your miserable existence." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, relishing the quiet warmth in my kitchen while she lost her mind on the street. "I am moving into Garrett's luxury penthouse today," she continued, her voice echoing with venom and unearned entitlement. "He actually knows how to treat a woman of my caliber. And do not think for 1 second you are getting off easy. I am calling a ruthless divorce lawyer this very afternoon. I am going to take exactly half of that rundown house you love so much. I am going to take half of your pathetic mechanic pension. I will bleed your retirement savings completely dry. You will be living in a dirty studio apartment by the end of the year while I am flying first class to Paris." She paused, breathing heavily, expecting me to beg or apologize. She expected the humble husband to plead for his wife to come back. Instead, I looked at the severed pieces of her credit cards resting on the counter. The absolute delusion of her threats was almost comical. She honestly believed my mechanic pension was the prize. I did not say a single word to her. I simply pressed the red button and ended the call. Her hysterical threats were instantly cut off, leaving the kitchen in total silence once again. I finished my coffee, washed my mug, and walked upstairs to put on my tailored charcoal suit. I bypassed my usual pickup truck and took a private car service straight to the financial district downtown. The towering glass and steel skyscrapers reflected the bright morning sun as I arrived. I walked into a highly secured high-rise building and took the private executive elevator directly to the top floor. The front desk receptionist stood up immediately as the doors opened. "Good morning, Mr. Chairman," she said with deep respect, bowing her head slightly. I nodded and walked straight through the heavy oak double doors into the executive suite. Mr. Hayes was already waiting for me at the expansive mahogany conference table. He is a brilliant corporate attorney with a reputation for absolute ruthlessness in the boardroom. For 30 years, I had quietly built a massive empire from the ground up. I took the meager profits from my auto shop and heavily invested them during the tech booms and real estate crashes. I studied global markets while Vanessa slept. I built diversified portfolios while she bought designer handbags and expensive shoes. I am the anonymous founder and majority shareholder of Apex Holdings. It is one of the most aggressive and successful venture capital firms on the East Coast. We control billions in assets. We hold the financial leverage over dozens of mid-sized tech companies. I chose to remain entirely in the shadows, keeping my name off every public document. I wanted to protect my wealth from the exact type of shallow parasitic behavior Vanessa was displaying right now. She thought she was divorcing a broke mechanic. She had no idea she was declaring war on a financial titan. I sat down in the leather chair across from Mr. Hayes. He handed me a thick black folder with a serious expression. "I understand the purification process is officially underway, Alvin," Mr. Hayes stated calmly, adjusting his silver glasses. I opened the heavy folder. It contained the complete financial profiles of Garrett and his entire tech firm. "Yes," I replied, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. "She made her choice last night. Now I am making mine. Show me exactly what Garrett owes us." Mr. Hayes slid a detailed financial spreadsheet across the polished wood table. "Garrett likes to project the image of a billionaire CEO," Mr. Hayes explained with a faint hint of absolute disgust. "But his company is drowning in massive liabilities. His entire lifestyle is heavily funded by corporate debt. He leases those expensive sports cars. He rents that luxury penthouse. 3 months ago, his company secured a $50 million bridge loan to keep their new virtual reality project afloat. And who holds the primary collateral on that specific commercial loan?" I asked, leaning forward and inspecting the highlighted red numbers on the page. "We do," Mr. Hayes replied smoothly. "Apex Holdings owns 80% of their debt structure through a quiet proxy firm. Garrett signed a highly aggressive contract to get that cash. If his company misses a single financial milestone, or if we detect any critical instability, we have the legal right to call in the entire loan immediately. He is essentially walking on a tight rope over a very deep canyon." I looked at the photograph of Garrett attached to the inside of the file. He was a smug-looking 55-year-old white man with perfectly bleached teeth and an expensive haircut. He thought he was entirely untouchable. He thought he could sleep with another man's wife simply because he handed her a paycheck and bought her a few expensive dinners. He believed his corporate title made him a god among men. "Initiate a complete credit squeeze," I instructed, staring coldly at Garrett's arrogant face. "Freeze any additional funding for his company immediately. Trigger a sudden audit on their quarterly projections. I want the financial pressure applied so tightly that he cannot even breathe without asking our permission. Do not call in the loan just yet. Let the anxiety build. I want him to panic first. Consider it done, Alvin," Mr. Hayes said, closing the folder with a sharp snap. "By tomorrow morning, his accounting department will be in complete chaos." I returned to my quiet house that evening. The silence in the hallway was absolute. There were no loud footsteps or constant complaints about the room temperature. I was sitting in my armchair reading a complex financial report when my cell phone rang. It was Dominic, my 38-year-old son. I answered the call, hoping for a brief moment that my own flesh and blood was calling to check on his father after his mother packed her bags and left. I was entirely wrong. "Dad, you need to fix this mess immediately," Dominic demanded. His voice was completely devoid of warmth or concern. It was sharp and full of greedy entitlement. "Mom called me crying today. She said you cut off her credit cards and stole her car. What is wrong with you?" I took a deep, steady breath. "She cheated on me, Dominic. She proudly admitted to sleeping with her boss." I stated the raw fact, expecting some level of shock or defense from my son. Instead, Dominic let out a loud, exasperated sigh. "Dad, you are overreacting. Garrett is a very powerful man. He is a visionary in the tech industry. In fact, Mom talked to him about me today. Garrett just promised to make me the new vice president of regional sales at his company. Do you understand how much money that actually is? I finally have a real shot at the top. You need to swallow your stubborn old pride. Call Mom right now and apologize to her. Do not ruin my future because of your fragile ego." I sat perfectly still in the dimly lit living room. My own son was demanding I apologize to my cheating wife so he could secure a corporate title from the man who destroyed our family. I did not yell. I did not curse. I just ended the call. The next morning brought no peace. The heavy oak front door was shoved open with zero warning. My daughter Jasmine and her husband Bradley marched right into my kitchen as if they owned the very floorboards they walked on. Jasmine is 34 years old. She wore a sharp designer outfit that cost more than my first car. Her husband Bradley is a 36-year-old white man who fancies himself a tech entrepreneur. He wore a ridiculously overpriced vest over a casual shirt projecting the tired image of a successful startup founder. The truth is, he has never built a single profitable thing in his entire life. He survives entirely on the financial safety nets of other people. Bradley did not even bother to greet me. He slammed a thick stack of legal documents directly onto my kitchen table right next to my morning tea. "You need to sign these right now, Alvin," Bradley commanded with an unbearable level of unearned authority. He tapped his finger aggressively against the signature line. "It is a home equity line of credit. We are putting this house up as collateral. I finally secured a major investor for my new app development company. Garrett reviewed my business plan yesterday. He absolutely loved it. Garrett promised to inject $200,000 into my startup, but only on the strict condition that I match his initial investment. I need you to sign over the equity in this house today so the bank can release the matching funds." I stared at the dense stack of banking papers. My own daughter and her freeloading husband had barged into my home to demand I mortgage the roof over my head. They wanted me to leverage my completely paid-off house to fund a fake business venture backed by the very man who was currently sleeping with my wife. I did not reach for the pen. I just looked up at Bradley. He crossed his arms and let out a heavy, condescending sigh. "Look, Alvin, I know you do not understand high-level economics," Bradley said, shaking his head as if he were speaking to a slow child. "You are just a retired mechanic. You spent your whole life fixing broken engines and trading hours for hourly wages. That is a poor man mindset. This is how real wealth is generated. You leverage dead assets like this old house to create liquid capital. You have to take massive risks to sit at the big table. Garrett understands this perfectly. That is why Garrett is a millionaire and you are sitting here drinking cheap tea." Jasmine stepped forward and placed her hands on her hips. Her face was contorted with absolute disgust. "Do not be a stubborn and selfish old man, Dad." Jasmine snapped, her voice sharp and vicious. "Mom was entirely right about you. You are completely holding this family back. You have absolutely no ambition. Garrett is generous and knows how to actually live life to the fullest. You just want us to stay trapped in your pathetic, small-minded poverty. Stop standing in the way of our success and just sign the damn papers." I kept my face entirely blank. I looked at my daughter, my own flesh and blood. I looked at the expensive leather handbag hanging over her shoulder. I remembered a very different version of Jasmine from exactly 10 years ago. She had sat in this exact same kitchen crying her eyes out. She had just graduated with a completely useless degree and carried $90,000 in high-interest student loan debt. She was terrified her life was ruined before it even began. I did not give her a lecture on economics. I simply took the heavy grease-stained checkbook from my auto shop and wrote a single check to clear every last cent of her debt. I wiped out her entire financial burden so she could walk into her adult life completely free. I traded years of my own physical labor to buy her freedom. Now she stood in my kitchen wearing clothes I essentially paid for, calling me a pathetic poor man who lacked ambition. She was ready to throw me out onto the street to please a mother who abandoned our family and a white CEO who viewed us all as disposable trash. I finally moved my hand toward the stack of legal documents. Bradley smiled a smug, arrogant smile, thinking he had won. He thought the quiet old mechanic had finally submitted to his superior intellect. Instead of picking up the pen, I placed my hand flat against the heavy stack of papers. I pushed them firmly across the smooth surface of the table. They slid over the edge and crashed onto the hardwood floor. Dozens of pages scattered everywhere in a messy white pile. "I am not signing anything," I stated with a cold, razor-sharp finality. Bradley's face turned bright red with instant fury. "You foolish, ignorant old man," Bradley shouted, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You are going to die with absolutely nothing but a rusty toolbox. You just ruined my entire future." Jasmine let out a piercing scream of pure frustration. She kicked the scattered papers on the floor. "You are unbelievable," she yelled, her eyes blazing with raw hatred. "You are dead to me. Do you hear me? You are completely dead to me. I do not ever want to see your face again. Do not call me. Do not text me. You are no longer my father. You are just a miserable, broke old man dying in a pathetic, empty house." She grabbed Bradley by the arm and yanked him toward the hallway. Let us go, Bradley. He is not worth another second of our time. Garrett will find another way to help us. Garrett actually cares about our family. They stormed out of the kitchen. The heavy oak front door slammed shut with such extreme force that the windows rattled in their frames. The sudden silence in the house was incredibly peaceful. I did not shed a single tear for the daughter who had just disowned me. A diseased branch must be completely severed to save the rest of the tree. I calmly reached for the teapot and poured myself a fresh, steaming cup of chamomile. I took a slow, satisfying sip. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my highly encrypted secure phone. I pressed the single speed dial button for Mr. Hayes. He answered on the first ring. "Good morning, Alvin," Mr. Hayes greeted in his usual crisp, professional tone. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes," I replied, setting my teacup down. My daughter and her husband just formally severed all ties with me. They demanded I mortgage my home to fund Bradley and his new startup venture. It seems Garrett promised to match his funding. Mr. Hayes let out a low, dark chuckle on the other end of the line. "How remarkably foolish of them," he noted smoothly. "What are your exact orders, Alvin?" I looked down at the scattered mortgage papers still resting on my hardwood floor. "Initiate the next phase of the purification protocol." I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "Block every single associated credit line connected to my daughter. Cancel any joint insurance policies I still underwrite for them. Furthermore, I want you to look into Bradley and his startup app company. I know for a fact he relies on a seed capital firm for his initial operating costs. Find out who controls that specific seed capital firm." Mr. Hayes typed rapidly on his keyboard. A few seconds later, he replied, "I am looking at his corporate filing right now, Alvin. His primary seed investor is a subsidiary shell company called Horizon Tech Ventures." "And who exactly owns Horizon Tech Ventures?" I asked, already knowing the precise answer. "We do, Alvin," Mr. Hayes stated with brutal clarity. "Apex Holdings acquired that specific shell company 3 years ago. We currently control 100% of his operating capital." "Perfect," I said, leaning back in my chair. "Pull the funding immediately. Liquidate our position in his startup. I want his business accounts completely frozen by noon today. Let him beg Garrett for cash when his own company collapses." "Understood, Alvin," Mr. Hayes replied. "Consider him completely erased from the board." I ended the call and finished my tea. They truly believed they had won. They were planning a massive celebration dinner tonight with Garrett and Vanessa. I fully intended to make an appearance at that dinner. I wanted to look them directly in the eyes right before their entire false reality crashed down around them. That evening, the city was alive with the buzzing energy of the wealthy and privileged. I took a private car service to the Obsidian Room. It is the most exclusive 5-star dining establishment in the entire financial district. Reservations take 6 months to secure, and the leather-bound menu does not list any prices. I walked through the heavy glass doors wearing my old charcoal suit. The host tried to stop me, but I simply bypassed his podium and walked straight into the main dining hall. I spotted them immediately in the VIP section. It was a private elevated booth bathed in soft golden light. The entire table was a disgusting portrait of betrayal. Vanessa sat right next to Garrett. She wore a brand new diamond necklace and held a crystal flute of expensive vintage champagne. Garrett sat at the head of the table like a victorious king holding court. My son Dominic and his white wife Megan sat across from them, laughing loudly at a joke Garrett just made. My daughter Jasmine and her husband Bradley sat next to them, clinking their glasses together in pure celebration. They were toasting to their grand illusion. They were celebrating Dominic and his fake promotion to vice president. They were cheering for Bradley and his fake startup capital. They were raising their glasses to Vanessa abandoning a 40-year marriage for a wealthy white CEO. The laughter was incredibly loud and arrogant. It echoed over the soft classical piano music playing in the background. I did not rush my approach. I walked with slow, measured steps across the plush carpet. I stopped right at the edge of their private table. The laughter died instantly. 6 pairs of eyes turned to look at me. The sheer panic in Vanessa's face was absolutely priceless. She nearly dropped her crystal glass. Dominic stiffened in his chair. Jasmine looked away in shame. But Garrett just smiled a wicked smile. Garrett leaned back in his plush leather chair and crossed his arms. He possessed that specific type of arrogant confidence that only comes from a lifetime of unearned privilege. He looked me up and down with deep theatrical pity. "Well, well, well," Garrett announced loudly, drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. "It looks like the retired mechanic finally managed to find his way out of the greasy garage." Tell me, Alvin, did you take the public bus here tonight? Because they absolutely do not allow dirty pickup trucks in the valet parking lot outside. Vanessa let out a nervous, high-pitched laugh, trying her best to impress her new lover. Dominic kept his mouth completely shut, offering zero defense for the black father who gave him life and worked his hands to the bone for his future. Garrett reached into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick leather money clip bulging with cash. He slid a crisp $100 bill from the stack and tossed it carelessly onto the pristine white tablecloth. The bill landed right in front of me. "Do us all a massive favor, Alvin." Garrett sneered, his blue eyes flashing with cruel amusement. "Take this $100. Go outside and flag down a cheap taxi. Have the driver take you directly to the nearest budget nursing home. You simply do not belong here. You are ruining our beautiful celebration dinner with your depressing presence." Before I could even respond to the CEO, Megan decided to join the public humiliation. My 35-year-old white daughter-in-law leaned forward and wrinkled her nose in extreme disgust. She looked at my simple gray suit as if it was covered in toxic waste. "Honestly, Alvin, you should definitely take his advice." Megan mocked, her voice dripping with high society venom. "That suit looks like you bought it from a discount thrift store 20 years ago. The lapels are completely frayed and the fabric is incredibly cheap. You are literally an embarrassment to this entire family. We are trying to enjoy a high-class lifestyle now. Garrett is showing us what real success and wealth actually looks like. You standing there in those scuffed shoes is just pathetic for everyone." Dominic nodded along with his wife, choosing a wealthy white stranger over his own flesh and blood. Jasmine and Bradley shared a cruel smirk. My entire family sat there eagerly tearing me down to elevate a man who viewed them all as useful, disposable idiots. They thought they had entirely defeated me. They thought throwing a single $100 bill at my feet was the ultimate display of absolute dominance. I did not flinch or break eye contact. I did not look down at the money resting on the white linen. I simply reached out and picked up a clean cloth napkin from the edge of the table. I wiped the corner of my mouth, slowly projecting absolute calm in the face of their chaotic disrespect. I placed the napkin gently over the $100 bill, completely hiding it from view. I shifted my gaze directly onto Garrett. I locked eyes with him. I did not raise my voice or shout. I spoke with a quiet, icy precision that instantly drained the smug, arrogant energy from his face. "Keep your loose change, Garrett," I stated, my voice cutting through the ambient noise of the upscale restaurant like a sharp steel blade. "You are going to desperately need every single penny you can find to pay your bankruptcy lawyers. You sit here celebrating with a stolen wife and a table full of greedy parasites. You truly think you hold all the leverage in this dynamic. You think your corporate title makes you invincible against a man like me." I leaned slightly forward, planting both hands firmly on the edge of the heavy mahogany table. Garrett's smile faltered slightly. His right eye twitched. "Record this exact moment in your memory, Garrett." I commanded, my tone absolutely chilling and resolute. "Memorize the sweet taste of that expensive champagne. Look closely at the luxurious walls of this fine restaurant. I want you to remember this meal for the rest of your miserable life, because this is officially the most expensive dinner you will ever eat. You just bought your own total destruction." I stood up straight, adjusting my frayed suit jacket. I did not look at Vanessa or my treacherous children again. I turned my back on them and walked out of the restaurant with unbroken dignity, leaving them sitting in a sudden heavy silence. The sunrise the next morning brought absolute financial devastation. At exactly 9:30 in the morning, the stock market officially opened for trading. Garrett was sitting in his luxury penthouse drinking imported espresso when his personal cell phone started ringing uncontrollably. It was his chief financial officer. The man on the other end of the line was screaming in total unprecedented panic. Garrett grabbed his remote and turned on his massive flat-screen television to the global financial news network. A bright red breaking news banner scrolled rapidly across the bottom of the screen. His tech company was in a total freefall. Overnight, an anonymous heavyweight investment fund had aggressively dumped millions of shares onto the open market. The sudden massive sell-off triggered algorithmic panic across the entire trading floor. By 9:45, his company's stock had evaporated by a staggering 30%. Millions of dollars in corporate valuation vanished into thin air in less than 15 minutes. The brutal downward market movement instantly triggered the default clauses in his massive commercial loans. Margin calls were automatically activated by his lenders. Garrett dropped his espresso cup onto his expensive hardwood floor. It shattered into dozens of jagged pieces. The firm that dumped the shares was an untraceable proxy operating directly under Apex Holdings. I sat in my quiet suburban kitchen sipping my simple chamomile tea, watching the exact same financial news broadcast. I watched the red arrows point downward, indicating his catastrophic ruin. Garrett thought he was an untouchable titan of industry. He woke up to discover he was nothing but a helpless pawn on my chessboard. His fake empire was rapidly burning to the ground, and he had absolutely no idea that the retired mechanic he insulted was the one holding the match. The catastrophic financial collapse of Garrett and his tech company sent massive shockwaves through his pristine luxury penthouse. I knew exactly what was happening inside those expensive walls, even though I was miles away sitting in my quiet kitchen. Garrett was furiously pacing across his imported Italian rugs, screaming obscenities into his phone at his terrified board of directors. His carefully manicured image of a genius white CEO was completely fracturing under the immense crushing weight of impending bankruptcy. He was facing total ruin, and he needed someone to blame. Vanessa was sitting on his velvet sofa, attempting to soothe his fragile, bruised ego. She reached out to rub his tense shoulders and offered him a glass of expensive vintage wine. He viciously slapped her hand away. He yelled with pure venom that he did not have the time or the patience for her useless coddling when his entire empire was actively burning to the ground. He screamed that her distracting presence was the root cause of his sudden string of terrible financial luck. Instead of realizing she had foolishly abandoned a solid 40-year marriage for a volatile and cruel narcissist, Vanessa began to panic. She believed she simply needed to secure her position as his permanent partner before the extreme stress drove him away completely. She desperately needed to lock down the wealthy executive with a marriage certificate to guarantee her lavish future. Less than 2 hours after the stock market opened, my secure phone vibrated on my kitchen table. It was Vanessa. I answered the call with a flat and silent breath. "Alvin, you need to sign the divorce papers today." She demanded, her voice tight with frantic, aggressive urgency. "I am not going to drag this miserable process out in family court for months. I have already contacted a high-power attorney. You will sign an expedited mutual separation agreement so we can be entirely done with each other. I am moving on to a much higher level of life, and I refuse to let your pathetic poor existence hold me back for another minute." I took a slow, calm sip of my herbal tea. I did not argue or raise my voice in response to her aggressive demands. I simply told her that if she wanted an immediate and uncontested divorce, she would have to meet me at my legal representative office downtown at exactly 2 o'clock this afternoon. She let out a scoff of pure, unadulterated condescension. "Your legal representative," she mocked loudly over the phone line. "What kind of cheap strip mall lawyer did you manage to hire with your meager mechanic pension, Alvin? Do not embarrass yourself any further. Just text me the address and I will bring a real corporate attorney to explain the big complex words to you." I gave her the address of the towering skyscraper in the financial district and promptly ended the call. At precisely 2 o'clock, I sat in the expansive glass-walled conference room of Mr. Hayes' private legal firm. The sweeping panoramic views of the city skyline stretched out directly behind me. I wore my simple, faded charcoal suit, projecting the exact image of the defeated old man she fully expected to see. The heavy oak doors swung open. Vanessa marched in wearing a sharp crimson business dress that screamed of false authority. She was closely followed by a slick-looking white lawyer in a custom-tailored pinstripe suit. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and looked around the luxurious boardroom with a deep sense of absolute confusion. He clearly wondered how a retired African-American auto mechanic had secured a meeting room in one of the most elite and expensive corporate law firms on the entire East Coast. Vanessa did not even bother to sit down in the leather chairs. She stood at the edge of the polished mahogany table and crossed her arms over her chest. "Let us get this over with quickly, Alvin," she commanded, looking at me as if I were a dirty stain on the pristine carpet. "My attorney has drafted a standard dissolution of marriage. You get to keep your rundown little house and your tiny mechanic pension. I am keeping all my expensive jewelry, my personal savings accounts, and every single asset I accumulated while working at the tech firm. You are entirely cut off from my corporate success." Her lawyer puffed out his chest and snapped open his briefcase. Mr. Hayes sat calmly next to me with his hands folded neatly on the table. He did not introduce himself or offer our guests a beverage. He simply looked at Vanessa with the cold, calculating gaze of an apex predator observing a particularly clueless prey. "We will absolutely not be using your drafted documents today," Mr. Hayes stated with a voice as smooth and sharp as polished obsidian. He slid a thick, legally binding contract across the wide table directly toward Vanessa and her highly paid attorney. My client is offering a complete and total expedited severance of this marriage effective immediately. The terms are incredibly simple and entirely non-negotiable. You walk away with exactly what you currently hold in your personal bank accounts and your personal physical possessions. In exchange, you will sign a comprehensive waiver relinquishing any and all future claims to my client's current assets, future earnings, corporate holdings, and any undiscovered or hidden financial portfolios. Vanessa let out a loud, sharp burst of cruel, mocking laughter. Hidden financial portfolios. She laughed, wiping a tear of pure amusement from her eye. Are you hiding a glass jar of rusty quarters in the garage, Alvin? You have absolutely nothing of value. You are a mechanic who clips grocery coupons just to survive. Her lawyer quickly scanned the dense legal pages. He leaned over and whispered into her ear that the contract was ironclad but heavily favored a clean, fast break. He assured her that since Alvin was clearly destitute, signing the waiver of hidden assets was just standard legal boilerplate designed to prevent future frivolous lawsuits. She did not hesitate for a single second. She snatched a heavy gold pen from her expensive designer purse. She leaned over the mahogany table and eagerly signed her name on every single dotted line. She initialed the comprehensive asset waivers without reading a single paragraph. She legally severed herself from the multi-billion-dollar empire of Apex Holdings for absolutely nothing. She threw the gold pen down onto the table with a victorious, arrogant smirk. "Enjoy your miserable poverty, Alvin," she spat, turning sharply on her high heels. "I am going to marry Garrett and live exactly like a queen." She marched triumphantly out of the glass conference room with her lawyer trailing closely behind her. I remained seated in my leather chair watching the heavy oak doors click shut. Mr. Hayes carefully gathered the signed legal documents and placed them securely into his black leather folder. "The purification process for this specific liability is now officially complete, Alvin," Mr. Hayes noted with a rare grim smile. "You are completely insulated from her and her catastrophic mistakes." I simply nodded and turned my chair to look out the massive floor-to-ceiling window. 30 stories below, Vanessa stepped out onto the busy, sunlit sidewalk of the financial district. I could not hear her, but I knew exactly what was happening in that precise moment. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out her smartphone, expecting a loving message from her wealthy CEO boyfriend. Instead, her screen illuminated with a highly urgent corporate email marked with high-priority red flags. It was a mass communication from the Human Resources Department of Garrett Tech Company. Due to the catastrophic and unprecedented financial events of the morning, the company was initiating an immediate emergency workforce reduction. Her position as senior project manager was completely eliminated effective immediately without any severance package. Furthermore, a secondary personal email arrived directly from Garrett. It coldly informed her that she was an unnecessary financial burden and ordered her to completely vacate his luxury penthouse before the evening. Her corporate access badge was already deactivated. Building security had already packed her desk into a cheap cardboard box. I watched from high above as Vanessa stopped dead in the middle of the crowded sidewalk. She stared at her glowing screen in absolute horrified disbelief. The wealthy white savior she had abandoned her 40-year marriage for had just discarded her like worthless trash to save his own sinking ship. She was now completely unemployed, completely homeless, and legally divorced from the billionaire she thought was a broke mechanic. I left the financial district and returned to my quiet suburban home. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across my perfectly manicured lawn. I had barely stepped inside and taken off my suit jacket when the violent pounding on my front door began. It was not a polite knock. It was the frantic, aggressive pounding of desperate people who were watching their lives burn down. I opened the heavy door to find my son Dominic and his wife Megan standing on my porch. They looked absolutely unhinged. Dominic had sweat staining the crisp collar of his expensive dress shirt. Megan had dark mascara running down her pale cheeks, and she was gripping her designer purse like a life preserver in a stormy ocean. They barged past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation or offering a greeting. "Garrett is losing everything." Dominic shouted, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. "His entire tech company is collapsing right now, and their stock is essentially worthless paper." I closed the front door calmly, making sure the latch clicked. "And how exactly does his corporate failure concern me, Dominic?" I asked, staring at my frantic son. Because we invested in him. Megan screamed, stepping forward with wild, desperate eyes. We took out a massive second mortgage on our house. We liquidated our entire life savings. Garrett promised us a 50% return on our investment by the end of the quarter. He guaranteed Dominic that vice president position if we bought into his grand vision. Now the bank is calling us demanding additional collateral because the investment is completely wiped out. You have to sell this house, Alvin. You have to list this property on the market today and give us the cash to cover our massive debt immediately. I stood perfectly still in my own living room. I looked at the son I had raised with my own sweat and blood. I looked at the white woman he had married who felt entirely comfortable ordering a black father to sell his only home to cover their reckless gambling. They had secretly leveraged their own future to buy favor with a corrupt CEO who was actively sleeping with my wife. Now that their greedy shortcut had violently backfired, they expected me to sacrifice my security to save them. I walked slowly over to my armchair and sat down. I looked Dominic directly in his panicked, shifting eyes. If I call a real estate agent today and sell this house, where exactly am I supposed to live, Dominic? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously low and steady. I am 69 years old. This house is fully paid off. It is the only shelter I supposedly have left in this world. If I give you every single penny of my equity, where do I sleep tomorrow night? Dominic did not even hesitate. He did not look ashamed or conflicted by my question. He looked incredibly annoyed that I was even asking it. You can go into a nursing home, Dad, Dominic stated with chilling absolute cruelty. Garrett told me about a budget state-run facility on the south side of the city. It is very cheap. Your little mechanic pension will easily cover a shared room there. You are old and you do not need a whole house to yourself anyway. Megan nodded in aggressive agreement, crossing her arms tightly across her chest. Dominic is completely right, Alvin. You are being incredibly selfish right now. We are a young couple with a whole life ahead of us. We need to maintain our high-class lifestyle in our neighborhood. You have already lived your life. You just sit around drinking tea and clipping coupons. You do not need a paid-off house. You need to do your duty as a father and bail us out of this financial nightmare immediately. I stared at the two of them, processing the sheer magnitude of their betrayal. They were demanding I move into a miserable, underfunded state facility so they could continue driving leased luxury cars and attending fancy dinner parties. They were fully prepared to discard me like useless garbage. I reached deep into my pocket and pressed the physical button on my secure smartphone. I activated the high-definition audio recording application without taking it out of my jacket. I wanted their vile, demanding voices permanently captured on a digital file. I wanted absolute proof of their pure, unadulterated greed stored forever. I stood up from my armchair. I walked over to the heavy oak front door and twisted the deadbolt, locking it firmly with a loud, metallic click. I turned around to face my son and his wife. My posture was completely rigid. My expression was carved from solid ice. I am not selling my house, I stated with absolute finality. I am not giving you a single dollar. You made a foolish, greedy investment with a corrupt man. You chased fake corporate titles and fake wealth. You will face the catastrophic consequences of your own reckless decisions entirely alone. Do not ever ask me for money again. Dominic's face turned a violent shade of purple. The veins in his neck bulged with raw, explosive anger. He realized the obedient, quiet father he always manipulated was completely gone. You useless, stubborn old man. Dominic roared, his voice echoing off the living room walls. He marched over to my wooden fireplace mantel. He grabbed my heavy glass and brass retirement trophy. It was a beautiful commemorative award from the local auto shop honoring my 40 years of dedicated service. Dominic raised it high above his head and hurled it directly onto the brick hearth. The thick glass shattered into hundreds of sharp, jagged pieces. The heavy brass base clattered loudly across the floor. You are completely dead to me, Dominic screamed, pointing a shaking finger at my face. I hope you rot in this pathetic, empty house alone. He grabbed Megan by her arm. He unlocked the front door and they stormed out, kicking pieces of broken glass out of their way. I did not flinch when the front door slammed shut. I calmly looked down at the shattered remains of my retirement trophy covering the brick hearth. I walked back to my armchair and picked up my secure phone. I stopped the audio recording and saved the file directly to my highly encrypted private cloud server. Then I opened my secure banking application. 10 years ago, when Dominic and Megan first got married, they could not qualify for a traditional mortgage on their expensive suburban home. Their credit scores were terrible, and their debt-to-income ratio was entirely unacceptable. I had quietly stepped in and signed the complex banking paperwork as their primary financial guarantor. My pristine credit and massive hidden assets were the only reasons they had a roof over their heads. I dialed the direct line to my personal executive banker. "Good afternoon, Alvin," the banker answered respectfully. "How can I assist you today?" "I need to formally revoke my status as the primary financial guarantor on the mortgage for my son Dominic," I instructed, my voice devoid of any hesitation or pity. "I am withdrawing my collateral backing immediately. Initiate the legal process now." The banker typed rapidly on his keyboard. "Alvin, if I remove your backing, their interest rate will instantly skyrocket and the bank will demand immediate full repayment of the loan balance due to their recent high-risk second mortgage." "Trigger the default," I commanded coldly. Within 15 minutes, an automated email and a highly urgent text message hit Dominic's phone. His bank officially issued an immediate notice of foreclosure. The grace period was completely revoked. He had just smashed my trophy and demanded I live in a budget nursing home. Now he had exactly 30 days to pack his bags and vacate his own house before the bank seized it entirely. The financial slaughter I orchestrated from my quiet living room manifested with brutal velocity inside the city's most exclusive penthouse. By late afternoon, the massive glass doors of Garrett corporate headquarters were chained shut by federal bankruptcy receivers. The margin calls had completely drained his liquid capital. He was not just broke, he was buried under a mountain of catastrophic corporate debt. I knew the exact timeline of his destruction because Mr. Hayes monitored every single legal filing in real time. Inside his sprawling luxury apartment, Garrett was rapidly losing his mind. The carefully crafted persona of the untouchable white tech visionary shattered into a million pathetic pieces. He paced across his imported marble floors, ripping his custom-tailored tie from his neck. Vanessa sat frozen on the velvet sofa, wearing the same expensive crimson dress she wore to our divorce mediation. She foolishly believed she could calm him down. She stepped forward and tried to place a reassuring hand on his chest, murmuring empty promises about starting over together. Garrett violently shoved her away with such force that she stumbled backward. He looked at her with a gaze of pure, unfiltered hatred. "You are nothing but a curse, Vanessa." Garrett roared, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "The exact moment you brought your pathetic family drama into my life, my entire empire collapsed. You are a completely useless financial anchor." He stormed into the master bedroom and began wildly throwing her expensive clothes and designer shoes into her luxury suitcases. He dragged her heavy luggage to the front door and threw it directly into the hallway. "Get out of my penthouse and never contact me again," he screamed, slamming the heavy door right in her stunned face. Vanessa stood perfectly still in the sterile hallway of the luxury residential building. The heavy thud of the door closing behind her sounded like a judge bringing down a final gavel. She stared at the polished wood surface, unable to comprehend how rapidly her grand delusion had evaporated. Just 24 hours ago, she proudly walked out of a high-powered law firm believing she had successfully discarded a broke mechanic to marry a billionaire. Now she was violently discarded by the very man she had sacrificed her 40-year marriage to impress. She slowly bent down and grabbed the handles of her heavy designer luggage. She dragged her bags into the elevator and descended to the street level. She stepped out onto the cold concrete sidewalk of the financial district. The late afternoon wind was sharp and unforgiving. Business professionals in tailored suits walked right past her, completely ignoring the older woman standing helpless on the curb. She shivered in her thin crimson dress. The biting cold immediately forced her mind to replay memories she had spent months trying to suppress. She remembered the warm, comfortable house she had viciously mocked. She remembered the hot meals I always had waiting for her on the kitchen island when she came home from work. I had spent 4 decades making sure she never felt the harsh sting of the outside world. I had provided a quiet, unbreakable shield around her life. She had mistaken my absolute stability for mediocrity. She had traded a devoted husband who built a fortress to protect her for a chaotic narcissist who threw her out on the street the second his bank accounts dried up. Panic finally gripped her chest. Her credit cards were still lying in severed plastic pieces on my kitchen counter. Her bank accounts were frozen. She pulled her cell phone from her purse with shaking fingers. She desperately dialed the number of our daughter Jasmine. She prayed her daughter would answer and offer her a warm place to sleep. The phone rang endlessly. It went straight to voicemail. She dialed again and again. Every single call was entirely ignored. Vanessa stood alone on the freezing sidewalk, realizing she was completely homeless. Jasmine was not ignoring her mother out of spite. She was simply ignoring her phone because her own fake lifestyle was violently imploding inside her leased suburban townhouse. She stood in her expensive living room watching her white husband Bradley frantically shove his designer clothes and expensive electronics into a large canvas duffel bag. Bradley was sweating profusely. His eyes darted around the room in sheer panic. Just an hour ago, he received a devastating email from Horizon Tech Ventures. The seed capital firm had completely withdrawn all funding for his startup application. His business accounts were instantly locked. He was entirely ruined. "What are you doing, Bradley?" Jasmine screamed, her voice cracking with pure terror. "You cannot just pack up and leave. We have a massive mortgage payment due tomorrow. Garrett promised to match your funding. We just need to call Garrett." Bradley zipped his duffel bag shut with a sharp, aggressive tug. He turned to face my daughter, dropping the supportive entrepreneurial husband act completely. "Garrett is totally bankrupt, Jasmine," Bradley shouted, his face flushed with cowardly rage. "His company is gone. My investors pulled out, and your stubborn father refused to mortgage his house to save us. You are completely useless to me now. I only married you because I thought your family had hidden assets, or at least a wealthy corporate connection through your mother. Now you have absolutely nothing." He walked over to the digital safe hidden behind a painting on the wall. He punched in the code and grabbed the last $10,000 in emergency cash they had hidden away. He shoved the thick stacks of bills into his jacket pocket. Jasmine lunged forward to stop him, but he easily pushed her aside. "You are a spoiled, entitled brat, Jasmine," Bradley sneered, walking straight toward the front door. "Good luck paying for all this fake luxury." He walked out the door, leaving his wife behind without a second glance. The front door slammed shut behind Bradley, finalizing his cowardly escape. Jasmine collapsed onto her expensive imported rug. She buried her face in her hands and let out a loud, gut-wrenching sob. The grand illusion of her perfectly curated life was completely shattered. She had spent years posting photos of her high-class lifestyle on social media, bragging about her brilliant tech founder husband. She had aggressively mocked my simple mechanic clothes and called me a pathetic old man holding her back. Now the husband she paraded around like a trophy had stolen her last dollar and abandoned her the exact second the free money stopped flowing. She looked around the expansive living room. Every single piece of furniture was financed on credit. The luxury cars in the driveway were heavily leased. She had built a towering castle entirely out of debt and arrogance. She reached for her phone, seeing the multiple missed calls from her mother. She could not bring herself to answer. She had nothing left to offer anyone. As she sat on the floor, drowning in her own self-inflicted misery, a dark shadow fell over the frosted glass of her front door. The brass mail slot clicked open with a sharp, metallic snap. A thick, heavy envelope was shoved forcefully through the opening. It landed on the hardwood floor right in front of her trembling knees. The envelope bore the bright red stamp of a premier debt collection agency. It was a final notice of default on her massive platinum credit card balances. The exact cards she used to fund her lavish dinners and designer clothes. She stared at the terrifying red letters. She realized she had viciously burned the only bridge that could have ever saved her. She was entirely trapped in a cage of her own making. Vanessa had spent exactly 3 agonizing nights sleeping in a damp budget motel on the outskirts of the city. Her designer luggage was crammed into a room that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. The reality of her total abandonment by Garrett had finally settled into her bones, but it did not make her humble. It only made her incredibly desperate. She realized that she had hastily signed away her rights to any of my hidden financial portfolios, but she firmly believed that my physical house and my mechanic pension were still viable targets. She managed to secure a sleazy contingency lawyer who specialized in aggressive family law disputes. She filed an emergency petition in the city family court. Her legal filing boldly claimed that she had signed our initial expedited divorce agreement under extreme duress and severe emotional manipulation. She demanded the immediate liquidation of my suburban home and requested a massive portion of the equity to serve as her primary alimony. She wanted the cash to secure a new apartment and restart her life. She was attempting to use the legal system to forcefully extract the very last drop of blood from the man she had viciously betrayed. I received the court summons on a quiet Thursday morning. I did not feel any anxiety or fear. I simply handed the documents over to Mr. Hayes. He reviewed her desperate legal maneuver with a cold, clinical amusement. She was walking directly into a steel trap we had set weeks ago. She thought she was going to cleverly blindside a helpless retired mechanic in front of a judge. She had absolutely no idea that the chessboard had already been cleared. The family court was located in a towering concrete building downtown. The courtroom itself was sterile and brightly lit with heavy wooden benches and a high, imposing judge podium. I sat perfectly still beside Mr. Hayes, wearing my usual faded charcoal suit. The heavy doors swung open and Vanessa walked down the center aisle. She had completely abandoned the sharp crimson business dresses and expensive diamond necklaces she wore just a few days prior. Instead, she had intentionally dressed for a theatrical performance. She wore a plain, oversized gray cardigan and flat, sensible shoes. She had scrubbed her face entirely free of her signature dark red lipstick and heavy makeup. She wanted to project the exact image of a frail, broken woman who had been cruelly discarded by a tyrannical husband. She took her seat next to her contingency lawyer and immediately began to softly cry. When the judge called our case, Vanessa stood up and delivered an incredibly passionate speech. She choked back fake sobs as she recounted our 40-year marriage. She blatantly lied to the judge, claiming I was a financially abusive monster who controlled every single penny she ever earned. She painted herself as a fiercely devoted wife who had sacrificed her entire youth and career to support my failing auto shop. She claimed I had ruthlessly thrown her out onto the freezing street without a single dollar to her name, leaving her to starve while I lived comfortably in our spacious suburban home. She begged the judge for basic human compassion. She demanded that the court force the immediate sale of my house so she could receive exactly 50% of the market value. She pleaded that it was her only chance to avoid living in a homeless shelter. It was a masterful display of pure, unadulterated manipulation. She looked at the judge with wide, innocent eyes, completely omitting the fact that she had proudly bragged about sleeping with a wealthy white CEO and had voluntarily abandoned her marriage to chase a luxury penthouse. She thought her crocodile tears would secure her a massive financial payout. The judge looked down from his high podium. His expression softened slightly as he absorbed Vanessa and her fabricated tale of extreme marital suffering. He turned his gaze toward our defense table, fully expecting me to launch into an angry defensive tirade. I remained entirely silent. Mr. Hayes stood up smoothly and buttoned his custom-tailored suit jacket. He did not waste a single breath arguing against Vanessa and her fictional character assassination. He simply approached the bench with a pristine black legal folder. Your Honor, my client deeply sympathizes with his former wife and her sudden, unfortunate housing situation. Mr. Hayes stated, his voice echoing with absolute professional detachment. However, the emergency petition to liquidate my client residential property is completely impossible to execute. The opposing counsel failed to conduct a basic public records search before filing this aggressive motion. Mr. Hayes handed a stack of official notarized documents directly to the judge. Over a month ago, anticipating a significant shift in his retirement lifestyle, my client legally sold the property in its entirety. The house was purchased outright by a registered philanthropic organization dedicated to urban development. The capital from that sale was immediately transferred into an irrevocable charitable trust, a trust that the petitioner explicitly and voluntarily waived all legal rights to during the initial divorce mediation. The judge adjusted his reading glasses and scrutinized the heavy stack of property deeds and bank transfer confirmations. Mr. Hayes turned slightly to look at Vanessa and her increasingly pale attorney. My client does not own a single piece of real estate, Your Honor, Mr. Hayes concluded with a sharp clinical finality. He currently resides in that suburban home strictly on a month-to-month lease as a standard tenant. There is absolutely zero equity to divide. There is no house to sell. There is no money to extract. The heavy silence that fell over the courtroom was absolutely deafening. The judge closely reviewed the irrevocable trust documents and the signed property deeds. They were completely ironclad and legally flawless. The judge looked over his glasses at Vanessa and her contingency lawyer with a stern, displeased glare. He slammed his wooden gavel down onto the sounding block. This emergency petition is entirely baseless and legally impossible to execute, the judge declared loudly. The motion is dismissed with prejudice. Vanessa contingency lawyer instantly realized he was never going to see a single penny from this case. He angrily shoved his legal pads into his cheap briefcase and stormed out of the courtroom without saying a single word to his client. Vanessa was left completely alone standing before the judge. The realization of her absolute ruin crashed down upon her like a collapsing concrete wall. She had no billionaire boyfriend. She had no corporate job. She had no luxury penthouse. And now she knew with terrifying certainty that she had no house and no alimony to fall back on. Her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed directly onto the hard linoleum floor of the courtroom aisle. She let out a raw, guttural sound of pure, unadulterated despair. She was completely destitute and utterly defeated. I stood up from my chair and adjusted my frayed charcoal suit. Mr. Hayes gathered our documents and placed them neatly into his briefcase. I walked calmly down the center aisle of the courtroom. Vanessa was crumpled on the floor, weeping hysterically with her hands covering her face. I did not stop to gloat. I did not offer her a single word of pity or anger. I did not even turn my head to look at her. I simply stepped around her shaking form and walked out the heavy wooden doors, leaving her entirely to the consequences of her own boundless greed. The brutal aftermath of the courtroom victory was quickly overshadowed by the absolute corporate slaughter happening across the city. Garrett was completely stripped of his untouchable executive armor. His sprawling luxury penthouse was swiftly seized by the bank after he missed consecutive emergency payments. He was currently operating out of a cheap rented office space on the edge of the industrial district, equipped with nothing but a folding table and a single prepaid burner phone. The aggressive corporate creditors were relentlessly hunting him down, demanding immediate restitution for the millions of dollars he had foolishly squandered on his lavish lifestyle and his failed virtual reality tech projects. Every single one of his wealthy high society friends had completely abandoned him. His leased sports cars were repossessed in the middle of the night. He had absolutely nowhere left to hide and no one left to manipulate. In a final act of pure, unfiltered desperation, Garrett reached out to the very entity that had orchestrated his total financial ruin. He aggressively emailed and called the executive assistants at Apex Holdings, begging and pleading for a face-to-face meeting with their anonymous chief executive officer. He foolishly believed he could still utilize his famous corporate charm to negotiate a massive debt restructuring plan. He genuinely thought he could convince the mysterious billionaire to throw him a financial lifeline and save his severely tarnished reputation. After 3 days of pathetic groveling, Mr. Hayes officially approved his request. Garrett was granted exactly 15 minutes to plead his case at the Apex Holdings corporate headquarters. He spent his very last remaining dollars having his only surviving designer suit professionally dry cleaned. He wanted to project the confident image of a temporarily defeated but brilliant visionary who just needed a second chance. He had absolutely no idea he was walking directly into a meticulously designed execution chamber. Garrett arrived at the towering glass and steel skyscraper 20 minutes early. He nervously paced the pristine marble lobby, gripping his scuffed leather briefcase with extremely sweaty palms. When the armed security detail finally escorted him into the private executive elevator, his breathing became noticeably shallow and rapid. The elevator doors slid open on the highest floor, revealing an expansive penthouse boardroom bathed in bright natural sunlight. The floors were polished dark obsidian, and the walls were constructed entirely of soundproof glass, offering a dominating panoramic view of the entire financial district. Garrett walked into the massive room, trying desperately to mask his overwhelming anxiety and project authority. At the far end of the sprawling mahogany conference table sat a massive, high-backed black leather chair. The chair was turned completely away from him, facing the sweeping city skyline. Garrett cleared his throat nervously and approached the heavy wooden table, attempting to stand tall and project his former CEO arrogance. He clicked open his briefcase and eagerly laid out his desperate restructuring proposals. "Thank you for seeing me today." Garrett began projecting a false tone of confident camaraderie. "I know the recent market fluctuations have put our companies at severe odds, but I assure you my core tech vision is incredibly sound. I just need a temporary grace period to reorganize my liquid assets and we can both walk away highly profitable." The high-backed leather chair did not respond immediately. The silence in the massive room was heavy and suffocating. Then the chair slowly and deliberately swiveled around to face the table. I did not wear my faded charcoal mechanic suit today. I wore a custom-tailored midnight blue Brioni suit that fit my frame with absolute terrifying perfection. I sat with my hands steepled, resting them firmly on the polished wood. My eyes were locked directly onto his face, radiating a cold, suffocating, killing intent. I watched as the blood instantly drained from Garrett's face, leaving him as pale as a ghost. His jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. The confident tech visionary completely malfunctioned. Garrett stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes squeaking awkwardly against the polished obsidian floor. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head in absolute frantic denial. He looked around the empty boardroom, expecting to see a security guard or the real billionaire CEO stepping out from a hidden door. "What is this?" Garrett stammered, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. What are you doing sitting in that chair, Alvin? Did you get a job cleaning the executive suites after your wife left you? This is highly restricted property. Where is the chairman of Apex Holdings? I did not raise my voice or break my lethal, unblinking gaze. I am Apex Holdings Garrett, I stated with a voice that echoed with the heavy, crushing weight of an absolute monopoly. I am the sole architect of your complete financial destruction. I bought your toxic debt. I crashed your inflated stock. I ordered the total liquidation of your fake corporate empire. The color did not return to his face. His knees visibly buckled under the crushing realization that the retired African-American mechanic he had publicly humiliated was the anonymous titan who owned his entire miserable existence. He realized his filthy affair with Vanessa was the exact catalyst that triggered his catastrophic and permanent ruin. He had brought a biblical financial plague down upon his own head for a meaningless office romance. I reached deep into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I pulled out a single crisp $100 bill. It was the exact same bill he had arrogantly tossed at my feet inside the five-star restaurant just a few weeks ago. I placed my index finger firmly on the center of the bill and slid it slowly across the wide mahogany table. It stopped right at the edge, directly in front of his shaking hands. I looked at his terrified, pathetic eyes with absolute disgust. "Keep the change, Garrett," I commanded, my tone dripping with pure glacial disdain. "I am formally purchasing the entirety of your remaining corporate assets, your intellectual property, and your entire personal career for exactly $1 single. You will sign the bankruptcy forfeiture agreements waiting in that black folder right now. If you refuse my generous offer, I will unleash my massive legal team to pursue you for criminal corporate fraud, and you will spend the next decade rotting in a federal prison cell. You are completely finished." Garrett stared blankly at the $100 bill and then at the dense legal contracts resting beside it. He let out a ragged, desperate sob. He fell to his knees right there on the polished floor, begging and pleading for mercy. He cried that he was completely ruined and had absolutely nothing left to his name. He swore he would do anything to make it right. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the arrogant parasite begging and weeping at my expensive shoes. I pressed a small silver security button hidden beneath the mahogany table. The heavy oak doors swung open immediately. Two massive corporate security guards in dark suits stepped into the boardroom. They did not wait for Garrett to stand up or compose himself. They grabbed him violently by his armpits, lifting his shaking body completely off the floor. His briefcase spilled open, scattering his useless restructuring plans across the carpet. "Drag this trash out of my building," I instructed coldly, turning my executive chair back to face the sprawling city skyline. "Make sure he leaves the $100 on the table." The security guards hauled the weeping, disgraced former CEO out the door and threw him directly into the service elevator, erasing his miserable presence from my empire forever. The crushing weight of my financial retaliation did not stop at the polished obsidian floors of my corporate boardroom. It flowed directly into the manicured suburban streets where my son Dominic had built his fraudulent life. The 30-day grace period I had abruptly canceled evaporated faster than a drop of water on a hot engine block. Dominic was sitting on his expensive imported leather sofa, staring blankly at the massive flat-screen television. He was waiting for a miracle from a tech CEO who was currently being tossed into a service elevator by my security guards. The loud, aggressive knock on his front door did not belong to a delivery driver dropping off gourmet food. It was the heavy, authoritative pounding of the county sheriff, accompanied by two stone-faced representatives from the primary lending bank. Dominic slowly opened the door, wearing his designer silk pajamas. The sheriff did not offer a polite greeting. He simply handed my son a thick stack of neon-certified legal documents. It was the absolute and final notice of immediate foreclosure. The bank was executing their legal right to seize the property and all major assets within the premises to cover the massive high-risk secondary mortgage Dominic and Megan had foolishly taken out to impress a bankrupt fraud. The bank representatives coldly informed him that without my immaculate credit and massive financial backing, the property was in severe, irreversible default. They gave him exactly 48 hours to pack his personal belongings and vacate the premises before the locks would be professionally changed and the property auctioned off to the highest bidder. Dominic stood on his porch, trembling in the crisp morning air, holding the bright notice of his own total ruin. The grand illusion of his high-class lifestyle was officially terminated. The devastating reality of the foreclosure was quickly eclipsed by a much larger media explosion. By noon, the financial news networks had somehow caught wind of the massive corporate takeover that occurred in my boardroom. The aggressive financial blogs and global business outlets began buzzing with the shocking revelation that Garrett tech empire was absorbed for $1 by Apex Holdings. And for the very first time, my name was officially leaked to the press as the anonymous majority shareholder of the venture capital firm. Megan was sitting at the marble kitchen island, desperately scrolling through her smartphone when the breaking news alert flashed across her screen. She read the article detailing the billions of dollars in assets controlled by the retired African-American mechanic she had relentlessly mocked just a few days ago. The blood drained completely from her pale face. She looked up from her glowing screen and stared at Dominic, who was frantically pacing the living room floor, trying to figure out how to rent a moving truck with zero credit. "You absolute miserable idiot," Megan screamed, her voice cracking with a terrifying mixture of raw fury and profound regret. She marched across the living room and delivered a vicious, ringing slap directly across Dominic's right cheek. The loud crack echoed through the spacious, empty house. Dominic stumbled backward, gripping his reddened face in absolute shock. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Megan roared, pointing her shaking phone directly at his face. "Your father is a billionaire, Dominic. He owns Apex Holdings. He is the titan who just destroyed Garrett. And you stood in his living room and told him to rot in a cheap nursing home. You arrogant, stupid man. You forced us to leverage our entire future on a fraudulent white CEO while your own black father had enough wealth to buy this entire neighborhood." Megan did not wait for his pathetic, stammering response. She spun around and ran up the stairs to the master bedroom. She began violently throwing her expensive clothes and designer shoes into her luxury travel bags. She was a deeply pragmatic and ruthless woman. She knew the money was completely gone, and she refused to sink with a captain who had deliberately shot holes in his own ship. "You chose to abandon a billionaire father for a fake corporate title." Megan spat, dragging her heavy luggage down the stairs and heading straight for the front door. "I am going back to my parents' house. Do not ever contact me again." The door slammed shut behind her, leaving Dominic completely alone in a house he no longer owned. Dominic collapsed onto the hardwood floor of the grand entryway. The stinging pain on his cheek was nothing compared to the crushing agony of his spectacular failure. He had traded a loyal, wealthy father for a mirage of corporate power, and now he possessed absolutely nothing. He was a 38-year-old man with no job, no wife, no house, and a completely destroyed credit score. The suffocating silence of the massive empty house pressed down on his chest, making it difficult to breathe. In a state of pure blind panic, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone. He needed an ally. He needed someone who could somehow fix this catastrophic mess, or at least offer him a warm place to sleep. He desperately dialed his mother number. Vanessa had always shielded him from the harsh realities of the world. She had always indulged his arrogant ambitions and validated his greedy behavior. He pressed the phone tightly against his ear, praying she would answer and tell him she had secured a portion of my hidden wealth during the divorce. The call did not even ring. A harsh automated operator voice instantly filled the speaker. "The number you have reached has been disconnected or is no longer in service." Dominic pulled the phone away from his face and stared at the screen in absolute disbelief. He dialed the number again and received the exact same robotic message. He frantically opened his text messages and tried to reach her through various social media applications, but her profiles were completely deactivated. His mother had vanished into thin air. The wealthy CEO she proudly abandoned our family to marry had clearly discarded her, and she had no resources left to even maintain a basic cellular plan. The terrifying reality washed over Dominic like freezing water. The two people who had conspired to mock and discard a retired mechanic were now both entirely isolated and destitute. Dominic packed a single duffel bag with his remaining clothes and abandoned the foreclosed property before the sun even began to set. With his credit cards declining at every single hotel in the suburban district, he was forced to drive his leased car toward the grimy industrial outskirts of the city. He pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a rundown budget motel that charged by the hour. The neon sign above the office was flickering and missing several letters. He walked toward the front office, gripping his bag, hoping he had enough loose cash to secure a filthy room for the night. As he approached the glass doors, he stopped dead in his tracks. A woman wearing a faded, oversized gray uniform was pushing a heavy yellow mop bucket across the stained concrete walkway. Her hair was tied back in a messy knot, and her shoulders were slumped with profound physical exhaustion. She was scrubbing a puddle of spilled soda near an overflowing trash can. It was Vanessa. The woman who just weeks ago wore tailored crimson business dresses and bragged about flying first class to Paris was now working the night shift as a common janitor at a miserable roadside motel. Dominic dropped his duffel bag onto the concrete. The loud thud caused Vanessa to slowly lift her head. She looked up from her dirty mop, her eyes locked with her son. The heavy silence between them contained decades of unspoken arrogance and greed, now reduced to absolute ruin. They stared at each other under the flickering neon lights. There were no words to exchange. There was no comfort to offer. Mother and son simply stood there reflecting their shared humiliation, completely destroyed by their own blind, catastrophic ambition. The crushing reality of absolute poverty does not care about social media followers. Jasmine learned this brutal lesson exactly 48 hours after her cowardly husband Bradley abandoned her. The aggressive debt collectors did not send polite emails. They sent ruthless repossession agents. Her leased luxury SUV was towed away in the middle of the night, leaving her completely stranded in the suburbs. Her platinum credit cards were entirely frozen, blocking any chance of securing a hotel room or a hot meal. The landlord of her high-end suburban townhouse changed the locks and bolted a bright yellow eviction notice directly to the front door. She had absolutely nowhere to go and no one to call. Her carefully curated circle of wealthy friends instantly stopped answering her desperate text messages the second they realized she was broke. Jasmine was forced to wander the city streets on foot. She wore a wrinkled designer trench coat over sweatpants, carrying the last of her belongings in a cheap canvas tote bag. The expensive leather heels she wore to the five-star celebration dinner were now giving her severe bleeding blisters with every single agonizing step. She walked for 3 exhausting miles toward my suburban neighborhood. Hunger and physical pain had completely eroded her fake high society pride. She was marching right back to the very same house where she had viciously disowned me. She intended to beg the pathetic retired mechanic for a warm bed and a hot meal. She fully expected to find me sitting in my worn armchair, eager to forgive my precious daughter and offer her my meager pension to save her from the streets. Jasmine limped up the familiar suburban street, dragging her canvas bag across the pavement. She approached the edge of my property and stopped completely dead in her tracks. The front yard was no longer the simple patch of grass I used to mow on Sunday mornings. The entire landscaping had been professionally redesigned with sleek modern stones and drought-resistant plants. The driveway was repaved and immaculate, but it was the massive structure resting securely on the front porch that caused her exhausted brain to completely short-circuit. Bolted directly into the brickwork next to the heavy oak door was a pristine, polished brass plaque. The engraved black letters reflected the afternoon sun with absolute glaring clarity. It read, "The Alvin Educational and Housing Foundation, a subsidiary of Apex Holdings." Jasmine stared at the brass plaque with her mouth hanging slightly open. She blinked rapidly, attempting to process the impossible words. She dropped her canvas bag onto the concrete walkway. She limped closer to the large bay window of the living room and pressed her hands against the cool glass. The old, comfortable furniture she grew up with was entirely gone. My worn armchair, the television, the wooden dining table, they had all vanished. The interior of the house had been completely gutted and renovated into a sleek state-of-the-art corporate workspace. Several young professionals in tailored business attire were sitting at polished, minimalist desks, typing rapidly on high-end computer monitors. They were actively managing the massive charitable trust I had established. Jasmine stepped back from the window, her chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. She thought I was a broke mechanic who lacked the ambition to succeed. She was staring directly at a multi-million-dollar philanthropic operation bearing my exact first name. The heavy oak front door swung open with a smooth, silent glide. A sharp, highly professional African-American woman stepped out onto the porch holding a digital tablet. She wore a pristine tailored suit and a security badge around her neck. Jasmine aggressively intercepted her on the walkway, reverting instantly to her entitled defensive posture. "What is this place?" Jasmine demanded, her voice cracking with exhaustion and confusion. "Where is Alvin? I am his daughter. I need to speak with my father right now." The foundation director stopped and looked at Jasmine with a mixture of polite professionalism and deep underlying pity. She recognized my daughter immediately from the security briefings Mr. Hayes had provided. "I am sorry, miss, but Alvin does not reside at this property anymore," the director stated with a calm, measured tone. This building was legally transferred and fully funded last month. It currently serves as the regional headquarters for his philanthropic initiatives. We manage the millions of dollars he personally donated to assist underprivileged youth in the city. Jasmine shook her head violently, refusing to accept the catastrophic reality crashing down upon her. Millions of dollars. She stammered, her eyes wide with pure, unadulterated shock. My father does not have millions of dollars. He is a retired auto mechanic. He fixes old engines. The director offered a small, tight smile. Your father is the anonymous founder and majority shareholder of Apex Holdings. He is one of the wealthiest venture capitalists on the East Coast. He simply chose to live a quiet life without the burden of displaying his massive wealth. If you excuse me, I have a regional board meeting to attend. The director stepped gracefully around my trembling daughter and walked toward her parked car. Jasmine was left completely alone on the pristine concrete walkway. The sheer magnitude of her catastrophic mistake hit her like a speeding freight train. She had stood in my kitchen just days ago and called me a miserable, broke old man. She had proudly chosen the empty promises of a cowardly white fraud over the quiet, unwavering stability of her own black father. She had aggressively demanded I mortgage this very house to fund Bradley and his fake startup, oblivious to the fact that I already owned the very firm funding him. Her legs completely gave out beneath her. She collapsed, dropping heavily onto her knees right in the middle of the paved driveway. The sharp sting of the concrete scraping her skin was nothing compared to the agonizing pain tearing through her chest. She let out a raw, agonizing scream that echoed down the quiet suburban street. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, as the absolute finality of her situation locked her in a suffocating grip. She had viciously mocked my simple clothes and my quiet demeanor. She had prioritized the illusion of high-class society over genuine family loyalty. Now the husband she paraded around had stolen her last dollar and vanished. The mother she idolized was scrubbing toilets at a cheap motel. And the father she ruthlessly disowned possessed a financial empire that could have easily secured her future for 10 lifetimes. I watched her entire mental breakdown unfold in crystal-clear high definition from the live security camera feed transmitting directly to my penthouse office. I did not feel a single ounce of sympathy. I watched my daughter weep on the cold ground, knowing she had meticulously forged the very blade that severed her own lifeline. The subterranean parking garage of Apex Holdings was a fortress of polished concrete and high-level security. I stepped out of the private executive elevator wearing a perfectly tailored midnight blue suit. My personal driver was already standing next to the sleek black town car waiting to escort me back to my secure penthouse. The echoing silence of the underground facility was suddenly broken by the frantic slapping of cheap rubber sole shoes against the pavement. I stopped and turned my head slowly. Bypassing the outer security perimeter was a desperate, frantic woman, waving her arms wildly in the dim fluorescent lighting. It was Vanessa, the woman who had proudly marched out of a high-powered law firm wearing a crimson designer dress and diamond jewelry was completely unrecognizable. She wore a faded, oversized gray cleaning uniform stained with industrial bleach and dirt. Her hair was a messy, tangled knot. The expensive high heels she used to parade around the city were replaced by scuffed, cheap sneakers. She had somehow managed to track down my exact corporate location, likely after seeing the explosive financial news reports detailing my total ownership of the venture capital firm. She sprinted across the cold concrete floor, dodging a startled security guard who immediately reached for his radio. I raised my hand in a sharp, swift motion, signaling the guard to stand down and step back. I wanted to see exactly how low her profound arrogance had finally sunk. She stumbled to a halt just a few feet away from the polished hood of my luxury vehicle. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving with sheer absolute exhaustion. The harsh lighting illuminated the deep dark circles under her eyes and the bitter reality of her completely shattered delusion.
Alvin, please, you have to listen to me.
Vanessa cried out, her voice echoing loudly in the cavernous garage. Her tone was completely stripped of the cruel, mocking superiority she had wielded so proudly in my kitchen. She took another shaky step forward and violently threw herself down onto the cold, hard concrete. My 62-year-old ex-wife literally fell to her knees right in front of my polished leather shoes. She buried her face in her rough, calloused hands and let out a loud, dramatic sob. I made a catastrophic mistake, Alvin. I was completely brainwashed. She wailed, looking up at me with tears streaming down her exhausted face. Garrett manipulated my entire mind. He used his wealth and his corporate power to blind me to the truth. He told me all these grand, beautiful lies about our future together, and I foolishly believed him. I was under severe emotional distress, and he took absolute advantage of my vulnerability. You have to understand that I never actually wanted to leave you. I was just confused by his aggressive high society tactics. She reached out with her trembling hands, desperately trying to grab the pristine fabric of my suit trousers. I took a single measured step backward, keeping myself entirely out of her desperate physical reach. I looked down at her groveling form with absolute glacial detachment. She was actually attempting to rewrite a 40-year history of relentless financial greed and shallow social climbing. She wanted me to believe that a 55-year-old white CEO had somehow hypnotized a grown, independent black woman into viciously insulting her husband and abandoning her family. I remember you bragging about his custom-tailored suits and his luxury sports cars, Vanessa. I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, brutal precision. I remember you explicitly stating that you were upgrading to a real man because I was just a pathetic mechanic who smelled like motor oil. You were not hypnotized or manipulated. You were simply blinded by your own toxic, limitless greed. You actively chose to betray me because you genuinely thought he offered a faster shortcut to wealth. Vanessa shook her head violently, sobbing even louder. No, Alvin, that was not me talking. That was the illusion he created. I love you. I have always loved you. We spent 40 years building a life together. You cannot just throw all of that away because of one terrible mistake. I am begging you to take me back. I will do anything you want. I will go back to the house and cook your meals. Please do not leave me to rot in this miserable poverty. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of compassion. I simply reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a thick manila envelope that Mr. Hayes had personally delivered to my desk just an hour ago. The private investigators I employed did not stop tracking Garrett the moment I threw him out of my boardroom. They monitored his every single move as his entire world completely collapsed into ash. I opened the flap of the envelope and pulled out a stack of high-definition glossy photographs. I tossed them casually through the air. The photographs scattered across the cold concrete floor, landing directly around Vanessa's trembling knees. She looked down at the images and her fake theatrical crying stopped instantly. The photos clearly depicted Garrett sitting in the dimly lit booth of a cheap downtown dive bar. He was heavily intoxicated and wearing a wrinkled shirt, but he was not alone. And he was certainly not mourning the loss of his dedicated corporate assistant. He was aggressively kissing a young blonde woman who looked absolutely no older than 25. His hands were wrapped tightly around her waist as he bought her cheap drinks with the last remaining dollars he had in his pocket. These photographs were taken exactly 3 hours after I officially bankrupted him, and he violently kicked you out of his luxury penthouse. I explained, watching her eyes widen in sheer, unadulterated horror. He did not spend a single second agonizing over your sudden departure. He immediately found a younger, more naive target to feed his desperate, shattered ego the very minute he realized his money was completely gone. He discarded you effortlessly because you held absolutely zero actual value to him beyond a temporary workplace distraction. You believed you were securing a permanent place in the upper echelon of high society, but you were nothing more than a fleeting form of entertainment. Look closely at those pictures, Vanessa. That is the billionaire visionary you sacrificed our entire family to please. He replaced you before his corporate office was even fully boarded up by the bankruptcy lawyers. Vanessa stared blankly at the glossy photographs scattered across the dirty parking garage floor. Her entire body began to shake with a devastating, profound realization. She had destroyed her entire life, her family, and her future for a man who replaced her before the sun even went down on the very same day. She was not a tragic victim of high-level corporate manipulation. She was just an easily discarded pawn. You were never the grand love of his life, Vanessa, I stated, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. You were just a convenient tool he used to satisfy his own pathetic vanity. You were a temporary, shiny object he picked up to make himself feel powerful. And the exact second he lost his actual power, he threw you directly into the gutter without a single backward glance. I looked down at the woman I had protected and provided for over 4 long decades. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, hollow disgust. You willingly sold 40 years of a solid, loyal marriage for a worthless piece of trash. I finalized the brutal verdict. Now you get to live exactly the life you actively chose to pursue. I turned my back on her and walked smoothly toward my waiting luxury vehicle. The personal driver quickly opened the heavy rear door for me. I stepped inside the immaculate leather interior and settled into the comfortable seat. Vanessa let out a final agonizing scream, begging me to wait just one more minute. I did not turn my head. I simply nodded to my driver. The powerful engine roared to life, and the sleek black town car glided seamlessly out of the subterranean garage. We drove up the concrete ramp and merged perfectly into the bustling city traffic, leaving her kneeling completely alone among the scattered photographs and the absolute ruins of her own catastrophic greed. The smooth ride back to my secure residential high-rise offered a brief moment of absolute tranquility. I left Vanessa kneeling in the cold subterranean parking garage, completely drowning in the catastrophic consequences of her own boundless greed. I watched the city blur past the tinted windows of my luxury town car, feeling a profound sense of finalized order. The diseased roots of my past were systematically severed. My personal driver navigated the bustling downtown traffic and pulled smoothly into the highly guarded entrance of my private building. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked into the immaculate marble lobby. The head of building security gave me a subtle, respectful nod as I bypassed the main reception desk and approached the private executive elevator. I swiped my encrypted access card and the steel doors glides open instantly. My penthouse occupies the entire top floor of the building. The elevator is programmed to open directly into a private, secure vestibule right outside my front door. The ride up to the 50th floor was completely silent. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored midnight blue suit, fully expecting to step into my quiet, empty sanctuary. The heavy steel elevator doors parted with a soft electronic chime. I stepped forward and stopped completely dead in my tracks. The pristine private vestibule was no longer empty. Sitting directly on the polished imported marble floor were my two adult children. Dominic and Jasmine had somehow managed to bypass the lower security checkpoints, likely by waiting for hours and tailgating a wealthy resident through the service entrances. They looked absolutely horrific. Dominic was still wearing the heavily wrinkled designer silk pajamas he had on when the bank foreclosed on his home. His face was unshaven and his eyes were bloodshot from sheer, relentless panic. Jasmine was in an even worse physical state. She was barefoot, having discarded her painfully blistered designer heels somewhere on the city streets. Her expensive trench coat was stained with dirt, and she clutched a cheap canvas tote bag to her chest like a protective shield. The exact second they saw my polished leather shoes step off the elevator, they did not hesitate. They dropped straight down onto their knees right in the middle of the cold marble floor. They bowed their heads in a posture of absolute total submission. The arrogant, entitled adults who had screamed at me in my kitchen were completely gone. They were entirely broken.
Dad, please, you have to listen to us.
Dominic cried out, his voice cracking with raw, unadulterated terror. The bank took absolutely everything. Megan slapped me and moved back to her parents' house. I have zero money and my credit is completely destroyed. Jasmine immediately joined the frantic chorus of despair. Her face was drenched in hot, running tears. Bradley stole my last $10,000 and abandoned me. Jasmine sobbed violently, pressing her forehead almost completely against the hard marble floor. My landlord evicted me and changed the locks. We have absolutely nowhere to go. We are begging you, Dad. We know you own Apex Holdings. We know you have the power to fix this entire nightmare. Please do not leave us out on the streets. I did not invite them inside. I did not reach out to comfort my weeping daughter or my trembling son. I stood perfectly still in the entryway of my sprawling penthouse. I looked down at them with a gaze of pure glacial detachment. I reached deep into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my highly encrypted smartphone. I did not raise my voice to shout over their frantic, pathetic pleading. I simply tapped the screen and opened my secure audio files. I turned the media volume up to the absolute maximum limit. I pressed play on the specific recording I had captured in my living room just days prior. The pristine acoustics of the enclosed marble vestibule amplified the sound perfectly. Dominic's arrogant, commanding voice suddenly filled the air. "You can go into a nursing home, Dad. Garrett told me about a budget state-run facility on the south side of the city. It is very cheap. Your little mechanic pension will easily cover a shared room there. You are old and you do not need a whole house to yourself anyway." Dominic instantly clamped his hands over his ears, as if the sound of his own vile words was physically burning him, but the recording did not stop. A few seconds later, Jasmine's furious, screaming voice echoed off the walls. "You are completely dead to me. Do you hear me? You are completely dead to me. I do not ever want to see your face again. You are just a miserable, broke old man dying in a pathetic, empty house." I pressed the button and stopped the digital playback. The sudden silence that followed was incredibly heavy and suffocating. The audio had completely stripped away their ability to play the role of innocent victims. They were forced to sit on their knees and listen to the exact moment they ruthlessly threw their black father away for a fragile illusion of white corporate wealth. I looked at their horrified faces. "You made your positions remarkably clear in my kitchen," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, brutal precision. "You looked at a man who wiped out your student loan debt and guaranteed your massive mortgages, and you confidently decided I was a pathetic obstacle standing in your way. You actively chose to align yourselves with a corrupt CEO who viewed our entire family as disposable garbage." Dominic and Jasmine frantically scrambled to build a wall of pathetic excuses. "It was not me, Dad." Dominic stammered wildly, waving his shaking hands. "Megan pressured me into saying those horrible things. She manipulated my mind because she was completely obsessed with maintaining our high society status. She forced me to prioritize Garrett over my own flesh and blood." Jasmine nodded aggressively, agreeing with her brother's cowardly deflection. "Bradley did the exact same thing to me." Jasmine wept, gripping my pant leg with her dirty fingers. "He preyed on my financial anxiety. He poisoned my mind and made me believe you were holding us back. We were just highly stressed and severely manipulated. We did not actually mean a single word of it. We love you, Dad. You are our father." I gently but firmly stepped backward, pulling my suit fabric out of Jasmine's desperate grasp. I looked down at the two adults I had raised with my own sweat and blood. I did not feel a single ounce of anger or hatred toward them. The raging fire of betrayal had completely burned itself out, leaving nothing but a vast empty crater of absolute clarity. "You are 38 and 34 years old." I stated, cutting through their pathetic blame shifting with surgical accuracy. "You are grown adults who made highly calculated decisions. You eagerly participated in my planned destruction because you genuinely thought it would secure your own lavish futures. You threw away 40 years of absolute loyalty for a cheap shortcut to wealth." I paused and looked directly into their terrified, tear-filled eyes. "I am not holding on to any anger or resentment toward either of you. I finalized my verdict. I forgive you." Dominic and Jasmine both gasped. A sudden bright flash of desperate hope illuminated their exhausted faces. They genuinely thought the wealthy, forgiving father had returned to rescue them. They thought their tears had successfully unlocked the doors to my multi-billion-dollar empire. I shattered that arrogant illusion instantly. "I forgive you." I repeated, my tone dropping to a low, terrifying register. "But I will absolutely not save you." The hope drained from their faces faster than water from a shattered glass. "What?" Jasmine whispered, her voice barely audible. "But you just said you forgive us." "Forgiveness simply means I will no longer allow your toxic actions to poison my peace of mind," I explained with relentless, absolute logic. "Forgiveness does not mean I will hand you a financial lifeline to protect you from the catastrophic consequences of your own boundless greed. If I open my door and hand you my wealth today, I am simply enabling the exact same parasitic behavior that caused you to betray me yesterday. I am not a safety net for treacherous people. I am not a bank for adults who refuse to take accountability for their own spectacular failures." I took one final step backward, retreating fully into the expansive foyer of my pristine penthouse. I looked at the children who once brought me immense joy, now reduced to weeping strangers on my doorstep. "You wanted the high-class lifestyle of the elite." I delivered my final words. "Now you get to experience the brutal reality of falling from the very top. You will rebuild your lives with your own hands just like I did 40 years ago. Learn how to survive." I reached out and grabbed the heavy, polished steel handle of my security door. Dominic lunged forward, screaming my name and begging for just one more chance. He slammed his hands against the frame, but he was too late. I pulled the heavy, reinforced steel door completely shut. The mechanical deadbolts engaged automatically with a loud, decisive sequence of heavy metallic clicks, sealing my fortress entirely. I stood inside my quiet sanctuary, listening to the muffled sounds bleeding through the thick, impenetrable steel. Dominic and Jasmine collapsed heavily against the exterior of my door. They clung to one another in the sterile hallway, sobbing completely uncontrollably. The ultimate crushing realization finally broke their spirits completely. They were permanently locked out. The immense financial empire they tried to steal was sitting just inches away from them, separated by an unbreakable wall of their own making. They were officially and permanently severed from my life. The crushing silence of my penthouse was deeply satisfying, but the true orchestration of justice was happening far away from my pristine marble floors. Garrett thought being stripped of his company and his wealth was the absolute bottom of his downward spiral. He was completely mistaken. Financial ruin was merely the opening act of his punishment. Mr. Hayes had not simply liquidated Garrett corporate assets. During the aggressive hostile takeover, my legal team uncovered a massive labyrinth of severe corporate fraud. Garrett had actively embezzled millions of dollars from his own investors to fund his luxury sports cars and his opulent penthouse. He had forged critical signatures, including the documents he used to trap my daughter in his chaotic web of debt. Mr. Hayes meticulously compiled every single fraudulent wire transfer, every doctored quarterly report, and every illegal offshore transaction into a heavily encrypted digital dossier.
He handed that massive, undeniable mountain of evidence directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. At exactly 6 in the morning, heavily armed federal agents simultaneously breached the doors of Garrett's cheap rented office space in the industrial district. He was sleeping on a stained folding cot surrounded by empty liquor bottles and final notice eviction warnings. The federal agents did not afford him a single ounce of dignity. They aggressively kicked the thin wooden door off its hinges and stormed the tiny room with their weapons drawn. Garrett woke up in pure, blinding terror. The arrogant white CEO, who just weeks ago sipped vintage champagne and mocked a retired mechanic, was violently thrown face first onto the filthy linoleum floor. Cold steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around his wrists. The federal agents seized his burner phones, his remaining hard drives, and the pathetic remnants of his shattered life. He was aggressively hauled to his feet, entirely stripped of his false corporate armor. Mr. Hayes made absolutely certain that the media was fully alerted to the early morning raid. When the federal agents dragged Garrett out of the rundown office building, a massive crowd of aggressive reporters and flashing news cameras were already waiting on the cracked sidewalk. The harsh glare of the camera lights illuminated his spectacular downfall for the entire world to witness. Garrett was wearing the same wrinkled, stained dress shirt he had slept in. His hair was a greasy, tangled mess. He desperately tried to hide his face from the relentless media onslaught, turning his head away from the flashing bulbs, but the federal agents firmly held him upright, forcing him to walk the long, humiliating path to the armored transport vehicle. The financial news networks immediately broadcasted the footage of his arrest across global channels. They ruthlessly dissected his massive ego and his catastrophic failure, playing clips of his former arrogant interviews right next to the pathetic footage of him being shoved into the back of a police cruiser. The legal process that followed was incredibly swift and entirely merciless. With the ironclad evidence provided by Apex Holdings, Garrett highly paid defense attorneys immediately abandoned him. He was assigned a notoriously overworked public defender who quickly realized the case was completely unwinnable. Facing dozens of counts of wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and severe identity theft, Garrett was forced to accept a crushing plea deal to avoid spending the rest of his natural life behind bars. Standing before a stern federal judge in a crowded downtown courtroom, the disgraced tech visionary openly wept as his sentence was handed down. The judge expressed absolute disgust at his predatory behavior and his blatant manipulation of innocent investors. Garrett was officially sentenced to 10 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without any possibility of early parole. The man who bragged about his tailored suits and his elite status was permanently stripped of his identity. He traded his luxury penthouse for a tiny concrete cell and a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. His fraudulent empire was completely erased from history, leaving him with nothing but a decade of hard time to reflect on the exact moment he decided to insult the wrong man. His spectacular destruction was absolute and permanent. While Garrett began his long, miserable sentence in a federal prison cell, Vanessa was enduring her own customized version of hell. Her complete lack of any marketable skills or higher education meant she was entirely unhireable in the corporate world she previously worshipped. The woman who once acted as a senior project manager and demanded luxury vacations was completely rejected by every single hiring agency in the city. Her heavily damaged credit and immediate lack of a permanent address forced her to accept the lowest tier of manual labor just to survive. She was officially employed by a large commercial cleaning company that serviced massive corporate structures downtown. She spent her nights emptying trash cans, scrubbing filthy toilets, and wiping down glass doors for minimum wage. Her hands, which were once adorned with expensive diamond rings, were now permanently cracked and burned by harsh industrial cleaning chemicals. She lived in a constant state of agonizing physical pain and profound emotional humiliation. However, her ultimate punishment was not simply the back-breaking labor. It was the location of her newest assignment. The commercial cleaning company had recently secured a highly lucrative contract to service the most prestigious high-rise in the entire financial district. Vanessa's supervisor handed her a new security badge and ordered her to report for the early morning shift at the towering glass and steel skyscraper of Apex Holdings. She had absolutely no idea she was walking directly into the very heart of my empire. She stepped off the service elevator onto the highest executive floor, pushing a heavy yellow mop bucket and carrying a plastic caddy full of cheap bleach. The pristine, polished obsidian floors stretched out endlessly before her demanding hours of grueling physical labor. She began her miserable shift entirely unaware that she was cleaning the fortress of the man she had viciously discarded. At exactly 8 in the morning, I stepped out of my private executive elevator to begin my workday. I wore a pristine, custom-tailored gray suit projecting absolute effortless authority. My leather shoes clicked sharply against the dark obsidian floor, echoing through the expansive, quiet corridor. I walked slowly toward my massive glass-walled boardroom, holding a steaming cup of premium black coffee. A few yards ahead of me, a woman in a faded, oversized gray cleaning uniform was on her hands and knees. She was aggressively scrubbing a small scuff mark off the pristine floor with a rough sponge. Her hair was tied back in a messy knot, and her posture was completely bent and broken by pure exhaustion. I recognized her instantly. It was Vanessa. I did not alter my pace or change my direction. I walked directly toward her, my polished shoes stopping just inches away from her cheap rubber sneakers. Vanessa froze completely. She recognized the familiar scent of my cologne and the sharp, authoritative sound of my footsteps. The heavy, suffocating realization of where she actually was crashed down upon her shoulders. She was scrubbing the floor of the multi-billion-dollar company owned entirely by the husband she had viciously abandoned. The extreme humiliation was so absolute and crushing that it physically paralyzed her. She did not dare to raise her head. She kept her face pointed directly down at the soapy water reflecting in the dark, polished stone. She squeezed her eyes tightly shut, fighting back tears of intense, agonizing shame. I stood over her for a long, silent moment, looking down at the woman who had demanded I apologize to her billionaire lover. I did not speak a single word to her. I did not offer her a second glance. I simply stepped cleanly around her trembling body and continued my walk into my executive suite, leaving her kneeling on the cold, hard floor to finish cleaning my empire. The sheer, brutal reality of her new life was permanently sealed. I returned to the sanctuary of my penthouse office, feeling a profound sense of closure regarding my former wife. But the purification process was not entirely finished. The parasitic branches that had attached themselves to my family tree still required a final aggressive pruning. Megan and Bradley, the two white-in-laws who had actively poisoned the minds of my children and pushed them toward absolute financial ruin, refused to accept their crushing defeat. Despite the fact that they had both abandoned their respective spouses, the exact second the money evaporated, they possessed an unbelievable level of unearned arrogance. They foolishly believed that their brief proximity to my immense wealth entitled them to a substantial payout. Less than 2 weeks after Garrett was sentenced to federal prison, I received a thick legal summons delivered directly to Apex Holdings. Megan and Bradley had somehow pooled their remaining meager resources to hire a desperate, aggressive civil litigation attorney. They filed a joint lawsuit in the state Supreme Court demanding a massive percentage of my hidden assets. Their ridiculous legal petition claimed that they had invested significant emotional and physical sweat equity into our family dynamic during their brief marriages to my children. They argued that because they were formally recognized as family members during the time I secretly accumulated my billions, they were legally entitled to a retroactive distribution of wealth to maintain their accustomed standard of living. It was a staggering display of pure, unfiltered greed. They had openly mocked my faded mechanic clothes and actively conspired to throw me into a budget nursing home. But now they were demanding millions of dollars in compensation, simply for breathing the same air as a wealthy African-American man. I did not feel a single spark of anger or anxiety. I simply buzzed my intercom and summoned Mr. Hayes to my office. I slid the pathetic lawsuit across my glass desk. Mr. Hayes read the document and let out a cold, razor-sharp laugh. He assured me this was not a legal threat. It was a formal invitation to completely destroy them. The civil deposition took place in the expansive primary conference room of Mr. Hayes' private law firm. Megan and Bradley sat across the polished mahogany table looking incredibly smug and confident. They wore cheap off-the-rack suits attempting to project the image of respectable professionals who had been cruelly disenfranchised by a tyrannical patriarch. Their attorney began to aggressively lay out their ridiculous demands, threatening to drag my name through a highly publicized and messy trial if I did not agree to an immediate multi-million-dollar settlement. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the table, offering absolutely zero reaction. Mr. Hayes did not even wait for their lawyer to finish his opening statement. He opened a massive, heavy black binder and began to systematically execute the most brutal legal slaughter I had ever witnessed. "We will absolutely not be offering a settlement of any kind," Mr. Hayes stated, his voice echoing with lethal corporate authority. "In fact, we are officially filing a massive countersuit for extreme financial fraud, criminal conspiracy, and severe identity theft." Mr. Hayes pulled a stack of heavily highlighted banking documents and slid them directly across the table. He systematically dismantled Bradley first. He presented undeniable, irrefutable proof that Bradley had deliberately falsified his tech startup revenue projections to secure initial funding from Horizon Tech Ventures. He produced signed affidavits showing Bradley had actively engaged in wire fraud by transferring corporate seed money into his private offshore accounts. Then, Mr. Hayes turned his lethal gaze toward Megan. He presented the original secondary mortgage documents for the house she shared with Dominic. He pointed out the glaring discrepancies in the financial disclosures, proving definitively that Megan had willfully forged income statements to illegally secure the high-risk loan. "You are not disenfranchised family members seeking fair compensation," Mr. Hayes declared with absolute crushing finality. "You are documented financial criminals who actively attempted to defraud a federally insured banking institution and a major venture capital firm. If you do not withdraw this pathetic lawsuit within the next 60 seconds and sign a full legal confession of your fraudulent activities, I will personally hand this entire binder over to the federal prosecutor. You will both face a minimum of 5 to 10 years in a federal penitentiary for felony bank fraud." The smug, arrogant confidence drained from their pale faces instantly. Megan began to physically tremble, dropping her pen onto the floor. Bradley stared at the undeniable evidence of his corporate embezzlement with wide, terrified eyes. Their aggressive civil lawyer immediately recognized the catastrophic danger. He aggressively whispered into their ears, advising them to surrender unconditionally to avoid federal prison time. They did not hesitate. With shaking hands, they signed the comprehensive legal confessions and permanently withdrew their ridiculous lawsuit. They foolishly believed that signing the documents meant they were simply walking away with a stern warning. They had absolutely no idea that Mr. Hayes had explicitly designed those confessions to serve as the ultimate instrument of their permanent economic ruin. Within 48 hours of receiving their signed admissions of severe financial fraud, Mr. Hayes submitted the documents to the primary national credit bureaus and the major banking regulatory agencies. The devastating consequences were absolute and immediate. Megan and Bradley were instantly flagged and placed on a severe universal national credit blacklist. The highly restrictive federal fraud databases classified them as extreme financial liabilities. Every single one of their remaining bank accounts was abruptly frozen and forcefully closed by their respective institutions. Their credit scores plummeted to absolute zero overnight. They were permanently banned from ever securing any type of loan, any credit card, or any standard financial service in the future. They could not even pass a basic background check to rent a cheap apartment or lease a reliable vehicle. The modern economy forcefully and permanently rejected them. They were completely exiled from the comfortable, privileged world they had always arrogantly taken for granted. Their fraudulent actions had permanently marked them as radioactive untouchables in the eyes of every single financial institution in the country. The invisible, heavily fortified walls of absolute poverty closed in around them, trapping them completely without any hope of escape. The permanent financial excommunication forced them into a brutal reality they had spent their entire lives aggressively mocking. Without access to credit or corporate employment, they were dragged violently down to the absolute bottom of the working class. Bradley, the man who once wore expensive vests and loudly proclaimed himself a brilliant tech entrepreneur, was completely unemployable in any office environment. His documented history of corporate embezzlement meant no legitimate company would ever trust him near a computer or a ledger. To avoid starving on the streets, he was forced to accept grueling manual labor. He secured a minimum wage position at a massive non-air-conditioned shipping warehouse on the grimy industrial outskirts of the city. The soft, uncalloused hands that had only ever typed on high-end keyboards were now permanently blistered and bleeding from hauling heavy wooden pallets for 12 agonizing hours a day. His spine ached, and his arrogant pride was entirely pulverized under the crushing weight of physical exhaustion. Megan suffered an equally humiliating fate. The woman who used to sneer at my faded clothes and demand luxury vacations was entirely blacklisted from any respectable corporate or retail management positions due to her verified mortgage fraud. She was forced to take a miserable night shift job as a cashier at a depressing 24-hour convenience store situated in a highly dangerous neighborhood. She spent her nights standing behind a thick, bulletproof glass partition wearing an ugly, oversized polyester uniform. She scanned cheap snacks and sold cigarettes to exhausted truck drivers while fighting to stay awake under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. Her expensive highlights faded, her manicured nails chipped, and her high society arrogance was completely crushed by the relentless, grinding misery of her new existence. They were paying the absolute highest possible price for their ruthless, calculated pragmatism. The very same brutal world they had eagerly tried to throw me into had entirely swallowed them whole. The morning sun breached the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse, casting long, sharp beams of light across the pristine imported marble. I sat perfectly still in my leather armchair holding a steaming cup of black coffee. The towering silence of the sprawling apartment was absolute and completely unbroken. There were no arrogant demands echoing from the hallway. There were no false smiles or calculated manipulations happening across the kitchen island. I had successfully executed every single phase of my purification protocol. The aggressive financial parasites had been systematically crushed and permanently exiled from my existence. Yet as I took a slow, measured sip of my dark roast, a rare flicker of internal conflict brushed against my iron resolve. The cost of achieving this absolute flawless justice was the total eradication of my entire immediate family. I was a 69-year-old man sitting alone at the summit of a multi-billion-dollar empire without a wife to share the dawn or children to carry on my legacy. I looked out over the sprawling city skyline, wondering if the price I paid for my dignity was ultimately too steep. I had brutally severed a 40-year marriage and permanently locked my own flesh and blood out in the cold. Was this absolute isolation the inevitable brutal tax levied upon a man who refuses to be consumed? I swirled the dark liquid in my ceramic mug, weighing the heavy silence against the chaotic disrespect I had violently endured. The sheer magnitude of my total solitude pressed down on my chest, forcing me to deeply question if absolute victory was simply another form of profound, devastating loss. I finished my coffee and dressed in a simple, tailored black suit. My personal driver navigated the sleek town car away from the glittering financial district and drove deep into the older, forgotten neighborhoods of the city. We arrived at a quiet, weathered cemetery shaded by massive, ancient oak trees. I walked slowly along the uneven dirt paths, stepping carefully until I reached a modest plot containing the older headstones of my ancestors. These were the men and women who had raised me during an era of extreme systemic poverty and relentless racial segregation. I stood before the cracked granite markers of my grandparents and my uncles. They were incredibly proud African-American men who had worked their fingers completely to the bone in factories and rail yards just to put simple food on the table. They never saw a fraction of the immense wealth I currently commanded, but they possessed a profound, unbreakable sense of self-respect. I looked down at their resting places, reflecting heavily on the true value of a dollar. They taught me that money earned through blood and sweat is a tool to secure your freedom and protect your community. My ex-wife and my children had completely twisted that sacred lesson. They viewed money as a shallow weapon to buy false superiority and wielded it to exploit the very man who provided their comfortable lives. They fundamentally misunderstood the profound dignity of an African-American man who built a massive venture capital empire from the grease and grime of a local auto shop. They thought my quiet humility was a weakness they could easily manipulate. They believed they could strip away my humanity and toss me into a miserable state-run nursing home without consequence. Standing over the graves of the men who taught me how to survive in a hostile world, I felt a deep, powerful resurgence of absolute clarity. My family did not respect the brutal sacrifices required to build generational wealth. They merely wanted to harvest the fruits of my labor while actively plotting to chop down the entire tree. I had not betrayed my bloodline. They had viciously betrayed the fundamental core values of our entire ancestry. The crisp morning wind rustled the dry leaves of the ancient oak trees, scattering them across the weathered headstones. As I watched the dead leaves detach and fall away, the final lingering shred of my internal guilt completely evaporated. The absolute truth settled into my bones with clinical surgical precision. I did not destroy my family. I merely allowed them to experience the catastrophic consequences of their own boundless, treacherous greed. You cannot reason with a malignant, aggressive tumor. You cannot negotiate with a parasite that is actively draining your life force to fuel its own endless expansion. If I had shown even a single ounce of weakness or manufactured forgiveness, they would have ruthlessly sucked my financial empire dry and discarded my hollowed-out shell exactly as they had planned. Cutting them out of my life permanently was not an act of vicious vengeance. It was a mandatory act of absolute necessary survival. I had to cleanly sever the infected limbs to ensure the main body did not rot from the inside out. I had successfully protected the fortress I spent 40 years building. The extreme isolation I felt in my penthouse was not a punishment. It was the sterile, clean environment required for profound healing. I turned away from the modest gravestones and walked back toward my waiting vehicle with a renewed, unbreakable stride. The heavy burden of false familial obligation was officially lifted from my shoulders forever. I was no longer a victim of their emotional blackmail or their toxic financial demands. I was entirely free. I directed my driver to take me straight to the newly established regional headquarters of the Alvin Educational and Housing Foundation. I stepped through the heavy glass doors into the bustling state-of-the-art corporate workspace. The brilliant young professionals managing my philanthropic trust greeted me with genuine professional respect. I walked directly into my corner office and sat behind my expansive, polished desk. I opened the thick files containing the profiles of hundreds of highly gifted, hardworking African-American youth from the poorest districts of the city. These were driven, ambitious students who desperately needed seed capital and full academic scholarships to escape the brutal cycle of systemic poverty. They possessed the exact same hunger and raw determination I had when I first opened my auto shop 40 years ago. I picked up my gold fountain pen and began authorizing massive financial grants and full-ride university tuitions. I was actively pouring every single ounce of my immense wealth and my meticulous strategic focus into building a brand new legacy. I was investing in a generation of young minds who would actually respect the profound value of a hard-earned opportunity. The deep, quiet peace that washed over me was absolute and entirely unshakable. I did not need a treacherous wife or greedy, arrogant children to validate my existence. I had found my true, ultimate purpose. I sat in my sunlit office funding the brilliant futures of absolute strangers, and for the first time in my entire 69 years of life, I experienced the pure, flawless taste of total serenity. The quiet solitude of my penthouse was usually absolute in the late evening hours. I was sitting at my expansive glass desk reviewing a fresh stack of university scholarship applications for the foundation. The city lights far below glittered like a vast ocean of distant stars. My highly encrypted personal smartphone suddenly vibrated against the polished desktop. I glanced down at the bright screen. It was not a saved contact or a verified corporate line. It was a completely unknown local number originating from the gritty industrial sector of the city. I typically ignored unsolicited calls entirely to maintain my strict security protocols. However, a sharp, inexplicable instinct urged me to pick up the device. I slid my finger across the screen and brought the phone to my ear without saying a single word. A heavy, crackling static instantly filled the audio line. It was accompanied by the loud, aggressive roar of passing freight trucks and the distant wail of a police siren. It was the unmistakable, harsh sound of a cheap, public payphone. Then a voice broke through the chaotic background noise. It was incredibly raspy, exhausted, and completely stripped of any arrogant corporate polish. It was Dominic. My 38-year-old son was calling me from a street corner in the dead of night. His breathing was heavy and ragged over the receiver. He did not immediately launch into a frantic, chaotic rant like he had done at my front door months ago. He just held the receiver silently, listening to my steady breathing on the other end to confirm I was actually there. He knew he had absolutely zero right to intrude upon my peace. He knew the massive steel doors of my financial empire were permanently locked against him. He was standing in the freezing cold, holding a dirty plastic receiver, bracing himself to speak to the billionaire father he had viciously discarded. "Dad, please do not hang up the phone." Dominic finally spoke, his voice cracking with a raw, profound vulnerability I had never heard from him before. "I am not calling to ask you for a single dollar. I swear to you, I do not want any of your money.
I just need exactly 2 minutes of your time." I remained perfectly silent, allowing him the space to dig himself out of his own grave. Dominic took a shaky, desperate breath. The sound of his quiet weeping bled through the terrible audio connection. "I am calling to tell you that I finally understand." Dominic confessed, his voice trembling with the heavy, crushing weight of absolute realization. "I am working as a day laborer on a massive commercial construction site down by the shipping docks. I spend 12 agonizing hours a day hauling 80-pound bags of wet cement and stacking heavy cinder blocks in the freezing mud. My hands are completely covered in busted, bleeding blisters. My back is in constant, agonizing pain, and my knees feel like they're going to shatter every time I stand up." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh at his own pathetic reality. "I look at my ruined, bleeding hands every single night in my cheap rented room, and I finally realize what you actually sacrificed for me. You spent 40 entire years breaking your body in a filthy auto shop just to put food on my table and keep me safe. You traded your physical health to buy my ungrateful, arrogant future, and I repaid your massive sacrifice by standing in your living room and threatening to throw you into a miserable state-run nursing home." Dominic began to sob openly into the public receiver. The tears were not an act of calculated manipulation or a desperate attempt to secure a financial bailout. It was the agonizing, brutal sound of a deeply arrogant man having his massive ego completely pulverized by the harsh, unforgiving reality of the working class. "I am so incredibly sorry, Dad." Dominic wept violently. "I let Megan poison my mind with her fake high society greed. I let a corrupt white CEO make me feel ashamed of my own hardworking black father. I was a disgusting, greedy parasite. I am working every single day until my bones ache just to pay off the massive mountain of debt I created. I am doing it entirely alone. I just needed you to know that I finally see the truth. I am profoundly and endlessly sorry." I sat perfectly still in my luxurious leather chair, listening to my son weep on a dirty street corner miles away. A few months ago, his words would have provoked a fiery, visceral rage inside my chest. But tonight, the raging inferno of my betrayal was completely extinguished. I absorbed his tearful, agonizing confession with a deep, profound sense of calm. The brutal education I had orchestrated was actively taking root inside his mind. The grueling physical labor was successfully hammering the arrogance directly out of his soul. I did not feel the sudden, overwhelming urge to dispatch Mr. Hayes to rescue him. I did not feel the paternal instinct to instantly wire $1 million into his frozen bank accounts and instantly erase his suffering. I recognized that his extreme physical and emotional pain was the mandatory tuition required to enter actual adulthood. "Dominic." I finally spoke, my voice cutting through the static with a low, steady resonance. The harsh, icy edge that defined my corporate retaliation was entirely gone. My tone softened, reflecting the quiet, unwavering strength of a man who had successfully survived his own brutal trials. "I hear your apology," I stated clearly and deliberately. "I recognize the absolute truth in your words today. You are finally learning the exact same harsh lessons your ancestors had to learn to survive in this unforgiving country. You are discovering the profound, undeniable difference between the fake illusion of wealth and the ironclad dignity of honest, grueling labor. You are feeling the exact weight of the world on your own shoulders without a safety net to catch your inevitable fall." I paused, allowing the gravity of my words to sink deeply into his exhausted mind. "I forgive you for your blindness and your profound disrespect, Dominic. I truly do. But my forgiveness does not come with a corporate checkbook. You broke your own life into pieces, and you are currently doing the exact necessary work to rebuild it from the ground up. I will not disrespect your difficult journey by handing you an easy, unearned shortcut." Dominic let out a shuddering breath over the receiver. "I know, Dad," Dominic replied, his voice steadying slightly. "I do not want a shortcut ever again. I just wanted you to know that I am finally trying to be a decent man." I nodded slowly, even though he could not see me from his dark street corner. The generational curse of toxic entitlement and relentless greed was officially broken. The parasitic branch was severed, and a much stronger, independent root was finally beginning to grow in the harsh concrete. Stand up on your own 2 feet as a proud African-American man, Dominic. I delivered my absolute final mandate. Pay your debts with your own sweat. Earn your own unshakable respect.
survive this storm, and build a life that no one can ever threaten to repossess. I did not wait for his final response. I reached out and pressed the red button to terminate the call. The line went completely dead. I set the encrypted smartphone face down onto the polished glass of my expansive desk. The heavy steel boundary between my financial empire and my former family remained entirely locked and heavily fortified. I would never invite him back into my penthouse, and I would never reinstate him into my multi-billion-dollar trust. However, the bitter, toxic hatred that had fueled my initial path of destruction was entirely gone. I looked out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the glittering, peaceful city skyline. The slate was completely wiped clean. I had successfully defended my dignity and established an absolute permanent perimeter around my peace of mind. I picked up my gold fountain pen and quietly returned to funding the bright, promising futures of the next generation. Exactly 24 months after that late-night phone call, my life had settled into a profound, unbreakable rhythm. I stood behind a polished oak podium in the grand ballroom of the City Convention Center. The massive space was brilliantly illuminated by hanging crystal chandeliers and filled with the vibrant energy of absolute hope. Tonight was the highly anticipated second annual gala for the Alvin Educational and Housing Foundation. Seated at the large round tables spanning the entire convention floor were 100 exceptional African-American teenagers. They were the brilliant, ambitious survivors of the city's most neglected and heavily underfunded school districts. I looked out over the massive crowd wearing a sharp, custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo. Mr. Hayes sat at the front VIP table, offering a firm, respectful nod of approval. These young men and women had endured systemic poverty, broken homes, and relentless societal roadblocks. Tonight, they were officially receiving fully funded 4-year university scholarships and comprehensive housing grants provided directly by Apex Holdings. I did not just sign a massive corporate check and walk away. Over the past 2 years, I had personally reviewed every single one of their complex applications. I read their essays detailing their brutal daily struggles and their fierce, unwavering determination to rise entirely above their circumstances. They possessed the exact same raw hunger I had when I opened my greasy auto shop 4 decades ago. I gripped the edges of the heavy wooden podium and leaned into the microphone. The excited murmurs in the grand ballroom instantly quieted down into a respectful, heavy silence. I welcomed them not as a billionaire philanthropist dispensing casual charity, but as a proud African-American elder officially passing the torch to the next generation of builders and corporate leaders. I announced the immediate distribution of their financial grants, and the entire room erupted into deafening, roaring applause. I stepped away from the podium and walked down the short flight of stairs to the main floor. The scholarship recipients immediately surrounded me. Young men in oversized rented suits and young women in modest dresses shook my hand with overwhelming, intense gratitude. Mothers and grandmothers who had worked multiple minimum wage jobs just to keep the lights on pulled me into tight, tearful embraces. Their tears were not the calculated, manipulative sobs my former wife used to demand luxury vacations and designer handbags. Their bright smiles were not the fake predatory grins my son and daughter flashed right before aggressively asking me to mortgage my fully paid-off house. This was the pure, unadulterated reality of genuine human connection. I looked into the determined eyes of a young man heading to engineering school and saw a profound level of respect that money simply cannot manufacture. I had spent 40 years of my life attempting to buy the love and loyalty of my own flesh and blood. I had foolishly believed that providing endless financial comfort would automatically shield my family from the harsh realities of the world and generate absolute devotion. Instead, it had completely rotted their character from the inside out, breeding a monstrous sense of toxic entitlement. I realized standing in this crowded ballroom that true loyalty is never purchased. It is actively earned through mutual respect and shared struggle. The students shaking my hand tonight did not view me as a massive, anonymous ATM or a foolish old mechanic to be exploited. They saw an African-American patriarch who recognized their immense, grueling effort and rewarded their relentless discipline. I was actively funding the architects of a brand new legacy. Every single dollar I transferred from my venture capital firm into their university accounts felt like a permanent brick being laid in a massive, unbreakable fortress. The absolute emptiness I initially feared when I locked my family out of my penthouse had been entirely replaced by a vibrant, overflowing sense of profound purpose. I had successfully traded a nest of greedy parasites for a vast, sprawling community of future leaders. The heavy, brutal sacrifice required to purge my life of toxic betrayal was completely validated by the brilliant, unshakable joy radiating across the entire convention center. Later that evening, I retreated to the quiet VIP lounge behind the main ballroom to enjoy a brief moment of solitude. A large flat-screen television on the wall was silently broadcasting the late-night financial news network. The scrolling ticker at the bottom of the screen caught my immediate attention. A sharp, prominent headline flashed across the display confirming the absolute finality of my corporate retaliation. The Federal Appellate Court officially denied all appeals for disgraced tech CEO Garrett. His massive legal team had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to overturn his 10-year federal prison sentence for corporate fraud and severe embezzlement. Mr. Hayes had personally ensured that every legal loophole was permanently closed against him. The High Court had completely crushed his final pathetic attempt at freedom. He would remain locked inside his tiny concrete cell for the rest of the decade, entirely forgotten by the high society world he had sacrificed everything to impress. The news segment seamlessly transitioned to a report on local working-class economic struggles. It served as a stark, vivid reminder of the brutal reality currently encasing my former family. Vanessa was still scrubbing industrial floors on the grueling night shift, entirely stripped of her fake corporate vanity. Dominic was still hauling heavy bags of wet cement at the shipping docks, slowly chipping away at his massive financial ruin with heavily calloused, bleeding hands. Jasmine was managing the chaotic register at a cheap discount retail store, learning the exact agonizing value of a single dollar. Megan and Bradley remained permanently blacklisted from the financial system, working miserable low-wage jobs and turning their bitter, toxic hatred toward each other. They were all violently thrown into the harsh, unforgiving machinery of the real world. They were currently struggling to survive, but they were actually surviving. The brutal, crushing weight of absolute poverty was systematically burning the arrogant entitlement completely out of their systems. They were finally learning the exact critical survival skills they had aggressively mocked me for possessing. I left the convention center and returned to the absolute pristine sanctuary of my 50th floor penthouse. The midnight city stretched out below my floor-to-ceiling windows like a massive glittering grid of electricity and endless ambition. The heavy steel security doors locked behind me with a firm, reassuring mechanical click, blocking out the rest of the world. I walked over to my custom mahogany wet bar and poured myself a single glass of an exceptionally rare vintage red wine. I stepped out onto the expansive private terrace. The cold, sharp night air hit my face, carrying the distant faint hum of the restless metropolis. I leaned against the thick glass railing and took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark, rich liquid. The taste was incredibly complex and deeply satisfying. I looked down at the thousands of bright lights reflecting off the dark river below. I had successfully waged a ruthless, asymmetrical war against the very people who were supposed to protect me in my old age. I did not flinch. I did not offer unearned mercy. I wielded my massive hidden wealth as a lethal surgical instrument to completely amputate the infected, rotting limbs of my own family tree. I absorbed the extreme pain of absolute betrayal and converted it directly into a highly efficient mechanism of total destruction and eventual rebirth. The strict boundaries I established were completely impenetrable. I raised my crystal glass in a silent, solitary toast to the quiet mechanic who endured decades of blatant disrespect and to the billionaire who finally burned their entire theater to the ground. Only when you completely clear the table of greedy parasites can you actually sit down and enjoy the feast. A profound, unbreakable peace settled permanently into my bones. The ruthless application of absolute consequences had flawlessly restored the natural order. The screen slowly fades to black. The ultimate lesson this story teaches is that true power never needs to announce its presence in a crowded room. Arrogance is always loud, constantly flashing designer labels and fabricated corporate titles to mask a fragile and entirely empty core. True wealth and absolute authority operate in complete silence. They observe, they calculate, and they strike only when the steel trap is perfectly set. When you foolishly mistake a person's quiet humility for weakness, you hand them the exact weapon they need to systematically dismantle your entire existence. Respect should never be conditional upon a visible bank balance, because the quietest person sitting at the table might just be the one who secretly owns the entire building. If this story of absolute calculated justice resonated with your soul, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments exactly how you cut the toxic parasites out of your own life.